The Netherlands, a small but stubborn country that managed to leave a mark on the world far larger than its size would suggest. First modern joint stock company, first modern stock exchange, first economic bubble, art, science, POLDERS. They also undoubtedly achieved considerable success in colonization. Took over the entirety of Indonesia and managed to hold on to it until the second half of the 20th century. And that wasn't their only colonial venture. They established colonies in Taiwan, South Africa, even founded New York. In short, they acquired quite a lot. However, over the span of a few centuries, they lost nearly all of it. They even chose to stay out of the Scramble for Africa, in exchange for other European powers backing off from their claims to Indonesia. The main reason behind these setbacks is fairly straightforward: a small population. It's difficult to dominate the world when your homeland doesn't even have 5 million people, a figure the Netherlands only reached in the early 20th century. So, how does one increase the population? The answer is simple: expand the homeland. Welcome to the Synthetic History channel, where we talk about events that didn't happen as if they did. Today I'll be telling a 1000-year story of the Netherlands, or rather what we refer to as the Netherlands, in the Paradox Games mega campaign. Many thanks to the Paradox Game Converters team, whose work made this video possible. Sit back and enjoy the story. The history of the region of the Lower Rhine, Weser and Maas rivers, aka Nederland, for a long time was not particularly noteworthy and not particularly documented. So let's walk through it quickly, for minimal context. It was the borderland of the Roman Empire, a place of mixing of Germanic tribes of Franks, Saxons and Frisians, who formed petty kingdoms fighting among themselves, of which at the time of 600-700 years, the most powerful was the Kingdom of Frisia, quite possibly not directly related to the Frisians. But all of them by the second half of the 8th century were overrun by the Franks, incorporating them into their actively developing empire and bringing Christianity. When the empire, as a result of hereditary division, fell into 3 parts in 843, the part of interest to us, Friesland, passed under the control of Lothar, after whose death his possessions were divided among his 3 sons. And again the part of interest to us went to Lothar II. And since the only thing that united these lands was their ruler, the kingdom was named after him, Lotharingia. He died without having left descendants, and Lotharingia became the subject of wars between 2 other fragments of the empire, the future France and Germany, in the end finally passing to the latter in 942. And 20 years later, the Kingdom of Germany became the Holy Roman Empire, a broth in which Frisia would continue to simmer for centuries to come. But this is what happened in the big politics, and what happened, so to speak, in the fields. The Vikings were happening. The power of the crown here was weak, there was no one to defend, and the proximity to Scandinavia made this region attractive for raids and as a logistical point. Viking rulers also established themselves here by analogy with Normandy, and some were even acknowledged by the king. Colonization, however, was minimal, because these lands were swamps, which were only to be drained, and therefore they did not establish themselves here. And when the number of Vikings in general began to dwindle after their adoption of Christianity, the local guys kicked them out. Or maybe it was all a fiction, because no traces of battles were found, only traces of trade, and the Frisians could invite Viking rulers themselves. Choose any version, the result is the same. The most successful in this expulsion was a certain Gerulf, who around 839 achieved recognition as Count of West Frisia, which then became known as Holland, the major power in the region, and his descendants came to call themselves the Gerulfings, in honor of their ancestor. For the next 2 centuries they gradually increased their influence, gaining new lands in the south for their service, while the local population accepted cultural influences and German colonists from south and east, and drained the swamps. As a result, by the way, a significant part of the peasant economic entities were not villages, but separate farms, a rather unique phenomenon for Europe. By the next millennium, the Gerulfings had acquired a fairly decent domain, and Germany was transformed into the Holy Roman Empire. Then a new rival appeared in the region, the bishopric of Utrecht, to which in 1024 the then emperor granted a rather tasty and extensive land holdings, just next to the Holland. At the very least, Utrecht was the largest city in the region, and there were also lands to the east. Thus, Utrecht became Prince Bishopric. The bishops almost immediately began to dispute the border territories, and even tried to make the counts of Holland their vassals. The latter enterprise was a failure, though, but the first one had some successes. The struggle was intense and covered the whole of Lotharingia. In 1049, Count Dirk IV died in an ambush organized by the forces of the bishops of Utrecht, Liege and Metz. The next count was his brother Floris, and these two names will occur quite often in our story. Floris and the other nobles of Lotharingia tried to fight the state of affairs by rebelling against the imperial authority, which approved of the actions of the church, and was ambushed and killed in battle in 1061. Déjà vu. The next count was his minor son, Dirk V, and from here I'll start talking in more detail. The regent under him was his stepfather Robert, son of the Count of Flanders, which was a fairly wealthy county in southern Netherlands, and he granted Dirk Zeeland, the islands in the Rhine Delta. This, however, was a formality, for they were ruled by Robert. Learning from the bitter experience of his father and uncle, Dirk decided to rethink his strategy, and began to make efforts to build good relations with the emperor. Then it was Henry IV. He visited the emperor, talked to him. We don't know what they talked about and what they agreed on, but when he came back, he started a war against the Frisian freedom. That's what they called these lands that had no sovereign and were ruled by petty nobles and quasi-republics. He justified his rights to these lands by the fact that the Gerulfings were descendants of the ancient kings of Frisia, the Folkwaldings, which naturally cannot be confirmed or denied. But whatever. The main thing is not words, but actions. And they happened. After a series of wars, he managed to conquer Middle and Eastern Frisia, and received from the emperor the title of Duke of Frisia. The main factor in this generosity was probably the friendship between Dirk and Henry. They were only 4 years apart in age, and they were kind of similar in character, ambitious cynics with plans to increase their own powers. The new title gave Dirk the opportunity to legitimize his new possessions, and at the same time created new claims to Great Frisia, which occupied the northern half of the Netherlands. Conveniently, the same name was applied to different territories. In parallel, he fought for power with Robert, who even after Dirk's adulthood retained a lot of power, and plundered funds from the count's treasury. But the problem resolved itself when Robert was killed in one of the battles in the Frisian freedom. To take Zeeland away from his young son was not difficult, especially since formally it did not belong to him, and so he became sole ruler of the duchy. By this time in the empire began a rather interesting process, the so-called investiture controversy, when in 1059 was created a college of cardinals, who chose the pope, and in 1080 Pope Gregory VII announced that now only the pope has the right to appoint bishops. Before that, the emperor could depose and appoint the pope, and he also appointed bishops. And bishops supported the emperors and were agents of their influence, serving as the feudal equivalent of governors. For the authority of the church, the changes were good, because the popes and bishops before often became all sorts of opportunists and relatives of emperors, not even former priests. But for the imperial power, it was a huge blow. Henry from such a statement freaked out and began to demand the re-election of the pope, for which he was excommunicated from the church. Dirk in this conflict obviously supported Henry, for which he was appointed Grand Chamberlain. But most of the vassals, especially in Lotharingia, saw this as an opportunity to reduce the power of the emperors, and revolted in order to install Count Gerhard of Strasbourg as puppet emperor. Dirk took advantage of the turmoil to seize the lands of the vassals of the bishopric of Utrecht, who supported the rebellion. His army was defeated by the rebels, as was Henry's, and Gerhard became the new emperor. Henry shamefully apologized to the pope, but retaining his vast possessions, began preparations for revenge. Dirk, on the other hand, was not perplexed, and immediately went to Strasbourg to bow. which earned him the favor of the new emperor. The emperor turned a blind eye to the continuing seizure of the possessions of Utrecht's vassals. Utrecht itself at the time was much weaker than Frisia, and the church now had no connection with the emperors, so the bishop could do nothing about it. Dirk then invaded the domain of the Count of POLDERS, divided between his two sons, and conquered them as well. Hence, he came to control the whole of Great Frisia, with the exception of the lands of Utrecht. The next goal was to have him recognized as king of these lands. There was already a precedent. Bohemia became a kingdom not so long ago too. The difference between the king and some powerful duke may not be significant, but it is fundamental. The king, aka Rex, is the anointed of God, and no one can revoke his title, at least on paper, while the duke is just a viceroy, a governor, whose power is inherited only because the real monarch cannot or does not want to revoke it. So the approval of God was needed, and the way to obtain it was found. There were preparations for the First Crusade, and for participation in this campaign, the Pope agreed to the establishment of a new kingdom. And in 1099, Dirk was crowned as the Dirk I, and went to work off the promise fighting for the Holy Land together with his heir Floris. I had warned you. The success of the campaign gave Dirk legitimacy, and the loot contributed to the economy and the building of new castles, as well as hiring military specialists from Normandy, taking advantage of connections after his daughter's marriage to William the Conqueror's son. Approval from the emperor was also obtained after Henry revolted, and, following Gerhard's death, wrested the title of emperor from him, documenting the existence of the Kingdom of Frisia by enforcing Utrecht's vassal dependence on Frisia, and appointing their kings as great imperial chamberlains. Then, as a result of coup, Gerhard's son, Lothar, was made emperor, and Henry died under not quite clear circumstances. Let's say he fell off a balcony. This was the end of the minor interregnum, and the reign of Eothenhan dynasty began. The authority of emperors during this time fell to the bottom, as well as their power, because it should be understood that in order to gain the support of vassals for the coup, it was necessary to promise them all sorts of privileges. Some were to reduce the requirements for the collection of militia for wars, some were to reduce taxes, or put the right person in the right office, to give the right to mint coins, and so on. And repeated 3 times, these handouts turned the power of the emperors into a pale copy of what they had 100 years earlier. Plus, Burgundy fell away from the empire. It got to the point that when the Duke of Jülich became King of France, Lothar couldn't take it back by force, because he was weaker. But for old Dirk, it was an opportunity to increase his domain. First, he got the French king excommunicated, and asked the Pope to recognize his claim to the duchy. After the excommunication, the French and Flanders had an excuse to overthrow the German upstart, and they revolted. Dirk, meanwhile, took advantage of the turmoil and invaded Jülich. After his death in 1126, the war was continued by Floris, and he succeeded completely, becoming Duke of Jülich. The victory had not only pragmatic value, like peasants and taxes, but also symbolic, because the old capital of the empire, Aachen, the burial place of Charlemagne, as well as a place with wonderful thermal springs, was located there. Perhaps Dirk wanted to conquer Aachen because of them. After all, we know that he visited them more than once. It was in Aachen where Floris had his coronation and the honorable reburial of Charles' remains, thus hinting at his imperial ambitions. Floris was not going to organize any coups and uprisings, though. The imperial title at the time was in many ways just a decoration. And again, plunging the empire into anarchy and exposing himself to fall off the balcony was not wanted. So let's say it was an action for posterity. This was the end of the occasions for the expansion of the domain, and for a long time the Frisian kings concentrated on the development of those lands that belonged to them. In this field there were 2 directions: the development of cities and the war against water. In the first one, the main thing at the time was the development of the processing industry, mainly textile industry, which was done by luring weavers from war-torn Flanders with stability and privileges, up to relocation of whole guilds, and by gaining wool suppliers from England. In the second, at the same time, the focus began to shift from draining the marshes to reclaiming lands near the ocean. It is important to tell more about what has happened to the coastline of Phrygia over the past centuries. At the beginning of our era, these lands looked like this: a huge swamp beyond the modern coastline. The situation did not change much until the year 800. But then, as the marshes were drained, which led to the subsidence of the soil and erosion of the shores, and as the sea level rose due to increase in the average annual temperature, the so-called medieval warm period, the sea began to take over more and more land in Phrygia. This process reached its climax around 1287, when a powerful storm swept away the sand barrier separating Lake Zuteza from the ocean, and turned it into a bay. More on the aftermath of that storm later. So, watching this process, the locals began to repel the attacks of the sea, and to go on a counter-offensive, which took place during the entire timeline of this story. Building dikes to protect or create shorelines, and drainage canals to divert water. Somewhere in the second half of the 12th century, windmills were added to this system, used to pump water from lands below sea level, which meant all lands. This is how polders were created, plots of land reclaimed from the sea. And now, let's get back to the wars, because despite the fact that inside the empire they clearly became less, but to compensate for it, from the outside there was a very curious thing: the Second Crusade. The first one was quite successful. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was created, but without an army of crusaders who captured the Holy Land to hold it for a long time was not possible. Plus, of course, these crusaders had to be delivered there, and for medieval logistics this task was far from trivial. So it was necessary to find money and people capable of doing it on a permanent basis. Problem. The solution was found, but it was rather eccentric, I would say. Queen Sisinanda of Aragon had a claim to the throne of the Eastern Roman Empire, and the empire itself was not at its strongest. Constant coups destabilized the power of the emperors. Therefore, it was possible to put the Queen of Aragon on the throne, and she will provide from the rich treasury of the empire money for the crusade. And the Kingdom of Jerusalem with such an ally under the side can last much longer. Also, in this way, they could try to eliminate the Great Schism, the split into the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Two birds with one stone. Wonderful. Floris, for his part, not only supported the plan, he led it. Thus, the Crusader forces were divided. Half went to implement this plan, and the other half decided that the scheme was a kind of murky, and just went to the Holy Land. And it would have been better if they had not been divided. With the second half, everything was quite simple. The Arabs defeated them pretty quickly, and the crusade ended in disaster. Meanwhile, the first one's adventure dragged on, for 4 years. Arriving in Constantinople, the Crusaders found that the garrison was indeed quite weak, and the army of the Greeks was unclear where, and they took the city under siege and blockade. The siege took a year, and once they entered the city, they naturally sacked it. Well, why didn't they just let the Crusaders in? They came to liberate it from the tyrant's oppression, and the townspeople were resistant. That's not right. Plus the imperial treasury wasn't there. Then Crusaders have gone to plunder Thrace and Bulgaria, having left in Constantinople a small contingent. Then Constantinople was besieged by the Greek troops, at last collected by the new Serbian Emperor Petrislav. The Crusaders managed to come to the rescue and defeated them. A year later, the situation was repeated. But this time, not all the Greeks had time to get across the Bosphorus Strait, and going to intercept them, Crusaders sailed to Anatolia, where the main battle took place. In the end, loyal Petrislav troops were defeated, and Sisinanda was crowned as Empress of the Roman Empire. But then the unbelievable happened. There was no money in the treasury, as well as the treasury itself, because they were spent on the war with the Crusaders, and what was left was taken by the escaped Petrislav. On this news, Floris reacted unusually, putting on the throne his nephew Wolfhard, who also took part in the campaign, saying that they themselves will make money here. On such insolence, in turn reacted Roman governors, refusing to obey some passerby. There was no more potential for Floris to impose the power of the new emperor in the provinces by force, because the Crusaders got fed up with all this mess, and so he had to be content with those lands that obeyed. Thus was proclaimed the Latin Empire. It didn't last long, 20 years, when, after a popular uprising in Constantinople, Wolfert was expelled from a city and the troops loyal to him were defeated by the governors. And while that period wasn't long, it took the Roman Empire a few more centuries to get itself back together, and even longer to retake Asia Minor. But that was a local problem, and the Crusaders went home because the main crusade ended in failure. But hey, they took a bunch of valuables with them. After returning from the campaign, Floris faced a new problem. The king of France died without leaving any heirs, and the new king was Adolphus, the ruler of Maastricht, a relative of his. Thus he became a vassal of Phrygia, but naturally he was not going to fulfill his vassal obligations. And Maastricht was a very important logistical point, because there was the only bridge across the river Maas, built by the Romans. The war began, and the Phrygians quickly seized Maastricht. But the king of France, for a long time, did not want to admit defeat. Then the Aquitanians, vassals of France, took the city and destroyed the bridge. Their forces were defeated, yet it was only after the Frisians went to Flanders that Adolphus recognized defeat and gave up his claim to the city. It was already up to the new king, Dirk II, to build a new bridge, as Floris died of a cold during the war. Déjà vu. In general, his reign was unremarkable, just a good ruler and manager, though the Third Crusade happened on his initiative. The fact that the main blame for the failure of the previous campaign was attributed to Floris. Well, it is not surprising, after all it was he who led the Roman venture. So Dirk wanted to fix his wrongs. By the way, Dirk himself in the previous campaign refused to go with his father, and went to the Holy Land, for what indeed had a great authority and reputation as a zealot of faith. The new campaign ended with the victory of the Crusaders and the creation of the Second Kingdom of Jerusalem under the rule of Wolfert's daughter. The children, in a way, corrected the mistakes of their fathers. He also sponsored the creation of a golden bust of Charlemagne. In this he continued his father's work to build future imperial legitimacy. I have already said that he was a good manager, but I didn't mention that he managed not only his own domain, but the entire empire, as he was regent under Emperor Ehrenfried. At the time of becoming regent, the latter was still a minor, but the years passed, and the powers of the regent did not decrease much. Most likely, both were interested in such a position of the scales of power. The emperor could devote himself to his favorite business, booze, and the regent could use, though limited, but still the power of the emperor for his own benefit. It came to the point that when Dirk died in 1183 and his son Floris II became the next king, Ehrenfried tried to rule the empire himself for 10 years, and then balked at it, and invited Floris to become the new regent. So when in 1200 Ehrenfried died, without having left male heirs, Floris was chosen as the new emperor, because he was already the actual ruler of the empire. A significant role, of course, was played by the built legitimacy of the Gerulfings as owners of Aachen, where Floris moved the court after his election as emperor. He devoted his short reign to the expansion of imperial power by taking possessions from Waldensian vassals. This religious movement at the time became quite popular. It, roughly speaking, can be called Christian communism. The rejection of private and even more so church properties, the propaganda of poverty, and so on. It is not clear why the feudal lords then accepted it. In any case, they were a great punching bag, which however also raised uprisings. Floris fought with the Waldensians while he was still king, and there was a funny story here. The thing is that the then Bishop of Utrecht became a Waldensian, and since the Waldensian church cannot have property, he renounced the office and declared himself Duke of Utrecht. Genius. Floris then went to war against him, defeated him, and took the duchy for himself. Thus, virtually the entire territory of Greater Frisia came under his direct rule. He then scaled up the process and began to take lands from Waldensian imperial vassals, primarily the Dukes of Saxony and Luxembourg, thus once again increasing his domain. He didn't think of keeping it in one hand, so he divided it between his two sons. The younger son Floris got the duchies of Frisia and Westphalia, and the older son Renaud, after the death of Floris II in 1212, got everything else, and became the next emperor. Plus, Floris II's wife was the Duchess of Lower Lotharingia, and her holdings then also went to Reinaud. Thus, the Gerulfings were divided into two branches, Frisian and Lotharingian, though Reinaud retained the title of King of Frisia and did not proclaim himself King of Lotharingia. The relations between the two branches were almost always quite good, so this division didn't bring harm. In a sense, even brought benefit, but more on that later. In one way or another, the new emperor devoted his reign entirely to war, whether it was wars against vassals to strengthen the power of the emperors, or external wars to strengthen the power of the empire. External wars he waged were against France, Denmark and Croatia, and he also led another successful crusade. This time they tried to install a local Catholic as King of Jerusalem. Spoiler, it didn't work. With vassals, he chose a very effective defensive strategy. First, slightly increasing centralization, slightly increasing taxes and militia requirements, or making some office appointed rather than hereditary, and so on. And then, when in response to these actions, disgruntled vassals revolted, Reinaud defeated them, took their lands, and gave them to loyalists, often his own sons, and then centralized again, and beat the disgruntled again. He also made cities another pillar of imperial power. Previously, cities could buy the right to self-govern from their immediate feudal owner and became a kind of quasi-republics. It was a fairly common practice, but not universal one. Floris, being a talented administrator, proposed to his brother a cool idea. When taking possessions from rebel vassals and transferring them to the loyal nobility, keep the cities under the direct subordination of the emperor, while giving them wide autonomy and self-government. In this way, future feudal vassals would be weaker, and potential, always loyal vassal cities would appear, because the emperor became the guarantor of their independence from feudal lords. Such cities became known as free imperial cities. Meanwhile, in their domains, Floris and Reinaud introduced a slightly different system of city government, but I will talk about it later. Using these measures of centralization, under Reinaud's rule, the power and the crown lands of the HRE's emperors reached their historical peak, for which he received the nickname Augustus. However, he didn't dare or didn't think to document the new state of affairs, when most of the vassals were his puppets, and make them appointed governors, although he probably could have. And so the vassals had a chance to get things back to the way they were. But the merits of Reinaud were great even without that. When he died in 1243, he left all his vast holdings, which was almost the entire western half of Germany and a large chunk of Italy, to his son Martin. And there's a reason I said peak, because it was Martin who started the troubles. And they began immediately with his election as emperor, or rather Roman king. How did the scheme for installing a new ruler of the empire on the throne work? After the death of the emperor, all the powerful vassals gathered somewhere, mostly in Aachen, and chose a Roman king. This king would then go to Rome to be coronated by the Pope, and only after the coronation would he become emperor. That's where the snag arose. The Pope demanded that one of Martin's daughters be made a nun. A big demand, of course, but not an outrageous one. Reinaud even gave his firstborn son Reinaud as a monk. Maybe that name would have been on their list of permanent names, if it hadn't happened. Who knows? So, giving up his firstborn was really kind of humiliating, but Reinaud took this step to keep good relations with the Pope. In fact, it was a very good relationship. The Gerulfings didn't fight for investiture, and here the reason was not in their piety, but in the fact that it was simply not profitable. What was the main feature of bishoprics? Their possessions cannot be taken away by force, and if you go to war on the bishop, you can be excommunicated. And if you get excommunicated, other feudal lords can also attack you and do God's work. But during the interregnum, everyone fought with everyone, including churchmen. And if they excommunicated everyone, they wouldn't excommunicate anyone at all. The effect was near zero. And so by the time of Gerulfing's reign, there were no churchmen left among the big feudal lords. Then the Waldenses gained popularity. Well, we already know the story. And generally, the result was that by the 30th century, the bishoprics had rather modest holdings. So bishops, as analogous to replaceable governors, were not interesting to the emperors. And as clerics, they were loyal to a loyal pope, who approved all the actions of the emperors. Floris was even canonized for his fight against the Valdenses, crusade, and other good things. That was super cool. So here's what I'm getting at. When Martin learned of the Pope's demand, probably because his older brother was censured as a monk, and that caused him childhood trauma, he reacted in a rather peculiar way. He gathered an army and marched on Rome, intending to subdue the Pope, or at least force him to crown himself. This situation was exploited by vassals, waiting for the emperor's moment of weakness. The Pope fled to the south of Italy, and even offered to solve the issue in peace, so that Martin went to suppress the vassals. But he, for a long time, stubbornly did not agree, for which was excommunicated. And then he realized what foolishness he is doing, and agreed to peace. And to remove the status of excommunication, agreed to organize the crusade, this time in Iberia. Then he went to suppress the rebellion, but the rebels successfully besieged Aachen and took captive his young son and heir, Dirk. Being in such a stressful situation, Martin, who let's say so was very fond of drinking, maybe it influenced his unusual decisions, began to drink even more, and eventually in 1249 died of a stroke without being crowned. So nominally he wasn't emperor. The rebels in turn declared to capture Dirk the new Roman king, and immediately forced him to undo most of his grandfather's reforms. Convenient. And the rest of the vassals didn't complain. They had everything done for them. Also convenient. Dirk was a man many of you would call literally me, seemingly capable, but unwilling to do anything. This conclusion can be drawn from the fact that nothing happened during his reign, at least not on his initiative. So much so that he didn't even hold feasts, but attended other people's feasts. If during the first part of his reign his uncle, who was his regent, did something, then after his death in 1274, the status quo was maintained for several decades. That is why the opinions of his contemporaries about his reign differed dramatically. Some of them condemned him for inaction, because there were all possibilities for revenge, the Geruflings retained huge possessions, and they called him lazy. And the other part praised the great charisma of the ruler, peace-loving, and his respect for ancient rights of feudal lords. This impression was especially strengthened after further events, but we'll get to that in a moment. And well, it's not that nothing happened at all. There was the sponsorship of the building of universities. There were wars against Muslims. The first was the regent's organized war for Sardinia, successful. The second was the crusade for the Holy Land. Honestly, I've lost count. Unsuccessful. In this crusade, there was a disaster that affected not only the Geruflings, but the entire future history of the empire. The only son and heir of Dirk, Floris, asked his father for the right to participate in the crusade, leading the army of the empire. There he was ambushed, and a few days later died from his wounds. After learning about the tragic death of his son in a foreign land, Dirk became depressed, and virtually removed himself from power. And when his beloved wife died, quite a rare case for the nobility, love, not death. A year later, from a heart attack, died Dirk himself, in 1304. All his vast domain passed to his eldest daughter Gertrude, and since women could not be elected, Norbert, king of Bohemia and grandson of Reinaud, was chosen as the new emperor. Gertrude was married to the Count of Metz before the death of Floris, and therefore her children belonged to another family, von Daun. However, during her reign, Gertrude did not sit idle. She declared herself Queen of Lotharingia and organized a coup, putting her cousin Sicco on the throne, and intended to be his regent. From that moment began the period of the Great Interregnum, which lasted intermittently for about 100 years. Because a year later, Norbert staged his own coup and took the throne back, and then it was taken away again. It happened for the previously mentioned reasons. To help establish a new emperor, or rather king, because in Rome in such conditions no one could be crowned, was profitable, because vassals get more privileges for it. And it was not so profitable to protect it, because in idea vassals and so should protect it, and so they would not get the reward for it. And then Sicco died of tuberculosis, leaving no descendants. Yeah, you can't make that up. Now let's talk about the main beneficiary of the past events, the Duke of Frisia Philips von Aven, the then head of the Frisian branch of the Gerolfings, who is also called the German Machiavelli, or rather the ideal ruler, according to Machiavelli. Being the most influential vassal of Gertrude, he was also the initiator and organizer of all her coups, and also helped her to suppress uprisings of discontent vassals, for which he received the Duchy of Utrecht, as well as Cologne and Berg. Also, seizing on the turmoil, he conquered Angria. He then took advantage of the fact that his wife was another of Dirk's daughters, Edith, and demanded that Gertrude relinquish the title of Queen of Frisia in favor of Edith, to which Gertrude, unable to wage war, agreed. Thus, after Edith's death, their son Dirk became King of Frisia, Dirk IV. In order that none of the Gerolfings would claim Frisia anymore, he started to be called von Aven, like, we are a different house, keep out of our way. Also, he is credited with killing Edith, so that his son would rule faster, but there is no evidence of this, only his general vibe. His achievements were not limited to intrigue alone, though. Under him, there began an active expansion of bureaucracy, made up of townspeople and petty nobles, for the collection of regular taxes, a system that would begin to replace the feudal lords. It was he who moved his court to the nascent city on the site of a dam on the Amstel River, which became a strategically attractive location with a good pay. The city became named after the dam, Amsterdam, and the money Philips invested in its development and the university built there to educate future officials made it the most important city in Frisia quite quickly. Amsterdam also became the first predominantly Lower German-speaking city in Frisia. Here, it is worth telling about the process of displacement of Dutch and Frisian languages by German. Since the reign of Floris II and the transfer of the court to Aachen, the language of the court was not Old Dutch, but Lower German. And although they were more like dialects of the same language than different ones, and all the locals could understand each other to a large degree, Lower German was generally more understandable throughout the empire. As it became the official language, it also became more favored in the cities, among merchants, and gradually spread to the lands under Frisian control through those merchants. Now is the right time to tell about the Frisian-Lotharingian legal economic system, in other words, customs union, which appeared under Floris III and Reinaud. It appeared due to the early centralization of the Gerolfings' domains, and its main feature was duty-free trade across the territory of Frisia and Lotharingia. Prior to this, every feudal lord had the right to collect a toll from merchants passing through his lands. But the brothers would abandon this, at least on their own lands. This allowed the cities of Frisia to trade freely among themselves and with farmers, and to specialize their industries by transporting goods by rivers, canals, and sea. This in turn helped them greatly in their competition against the Hansa, an economic and partly political union of North German cities, which had gained strength after the reform of the three imperial cities, as you remember also invented by Reinaud and Floris. This system worked in Lotharingia until the beginning of Gertrude's reign, but after the breakaway of Frisia and the division of her allotment between her sons, it collapsed of its own accord. Also, because of the lack of powerful feudal lords, the cities didn't need protection, and so they could rely on the garrison assigned by the ruler, and pay the tax for it, and had only equivalent of a police force. The cities on the coast had their own common navy, though, which acted as a proxy force for Frisia, for example in the fight against the Hansa. The interests of Frisian cities were in many ways the interests of Frisia, after all. And in case of real war, the fleet was rented by kings. The latter was generally common practice at the time. In addition to the right to self-govern, the towns also sent their elected representatives to the Landtag, State Diet, a body of class representation, where nobles, townspeople and clergy gathered, discussed their problems and worked out their solutions. Frisian kings were among the first to think of pitting influential burghers and nobles against each other in the Landtag, and act as arbiters in their conflicts, thus increasing their own power. But let's get back to big politics. The feudal lords got together and decided that to finally put an end to all these coups, they needed an emperor who wasn't connected to the Gerolfings. So, they picked Duke Leonard de Vrea of Burgundy. Yep, they went with a Frenchman. Under his rule, things were relatively stable, if you don't count the fact that he had no actual power and all the vassals just did whatever they wanted, and kept fighting each other. For example, Philip was fighting Gertrude over the right bank of the Rhine, and he even crushed her forces at the Battle of Hayange. Then he also joined yet another crusade, founding yet another kingdom of Jerusalem, this time under his daughter's rule. Oh, and he also fought Leonard, trying to get Dirk crowned emperor, which, to be fair, was Dirk's own idea. Not a great one, mind you, since literally no one backed him except the king of Bavaria. So Philip just tried to smooth things over, and even managed to defeat the numerically superior loyalist army in Austria. But you know, the key word is superior, so the war didn't exactly go great overall. Anyway, it all ended in the most unsurprising way for the time. After Leonard died, his heir was overthrown in favor of Gertrude's son, who himself got overthrown a year later by the king of Bohemia, Adalbero Bard, posthumously known as then Holy, or the Boat Saint. They called him that because, well, everyone knew he killed his brother, but his grandson still managed to get him canonized. The status was only revoked during the Counter-Reformation, by the way. As for Dirk's failed uprising, everyone just sort of forgot about it. Dirk himself didn't really bring it up either. After his father died in 1340, he gave up on any imperial ambitions and took up flagellation instead. So, Adalbero ruled for 10 years. And then, surprise, the nobles picked another de Vrea to be king. Because under those guys, you could do whatever the hell you wanted. Awesome. Well, awesome for the nobles. Not so awesome for the peasants, I suppose, as they were the ones shouldering the full burden of all these wars, being conscripted, taxed to death by local lords, and looted by visited ones. Eventually, in 1349, they'd had enough and launched a major rebellion, backed by several towns and even some feudals. And right around the time, something new showed up from the east, a curious little bacterium known as the plague bacillus. That's when the real fun started across Europe. Shortly after the pandemic began, Dirk died. Not from the plague, though. See, Amsterdam had quarantine measures in place. He just became convinced that the plague and the uprisings were signs of the apocalypse. And then he literally whipped himself to death. Yep, that things happened too. The new king was his son, Giselbert, and he now had to deal with the uprising right next to his own lands. Which, let's be honest, must have been super unpleasant. Because fighting a war during a plague sounds like a terrible idea. Armies are basically petri dishes with spears. And then he had to deal with the aftermath of the plague itself. In some cities, it wiped out about 50% of the population. Still, things weren't entirely green. By 1356, the Europeans were off on yet another crusade. And it was actually successful. Turns out the plague hit the Muslim world just as hard, if not harder. Returning from the crusade, Giselbert faced opposition from the feudal lords, who saw the weakening of the cities, hit hardest by the plague, as a sign of weakening royal authority, since the crown had relied on them. They demanded more privileges and kicked off a rebellion, but were utterly crushed, which in the end only strengthened the monarchy further and locked in a new order. Gone were the petty lords, replaced by appointed officials. Granted, many of whom were descended from those same lords, but still. Then began 25 years of relative peace, which ended, predictably, when the feudal elite regained their strengths and the old emperor was nearing the end of his days. The first to break the status quo was the king of Bavaria, who wanted to become emperor and launched the war to claim it. Giselbert saw an opportunity and demanded the de facto independence from the new emperor. Taxes and military support in the new vassal treaty were purely symbolic. The emperor, not eager for another conflict, agreed. A satisfied Giselbert set off on yet another crusade, and along the way smashed the army of fellow crusaders who were once again trying to stage a little regime change in the Eastern Roman Empire. An empire that had just started to resemble something close to its pre-Second Crusade itself, and was, at the time, allied with Frisia. Giselbert didn't live to reach the Holy Land again, sadly, dying of old age en route. His successor was Dirk V, the second Dirk V, because each title had its own numbering system. The Crusaders won yet again, wow, big surprise, and a member of the Von Dorn dynasty was installed as King of Jerusalem. Upon returning from the Crusades, Dirk found the empire still locked in a war that had already lasted 10 years, between the emperor and the coalition vassals trying to put Bruno von Thon on the throne. Dirk decided to end the war by demanding the emperor abdicate in his favor. And so, in 1392, he became the new Roman king, and immediately started pushing for centralization. No one liked it. The vassals rebelled. Two factions, in fact. The Von Don faction, who opposed Dirk himself, but not decentralization, and the Freedom faction, led by the King of Bavaria and the Duke of Pomerania, who were against centralization as a concept, but not against Dirk. These two factions even fought each other. This war turned into a brutal meat grinder. 6 straight years of non-stop bloodshed in Central Europe, with losses approaching 100,000 on each side, despite the rebels' apparent superiority over Frisia. Dirk even managed to take a break during the war and go to his coronation in Rome. How? Well, Frisia was able to hold out for so long thanks to mercenaries. They made up nearly half the Frisian army at that point. Sure, the other factions had mercs too, but mercenaries only care about money, and Frisia had the most, being the richest region in the empire, and Dirk had a massive treasury at the war's outset. Entire mercenary bands rose and fell over the course of this war, which featured tons of major battles, both victories and defeats. The Battle of Oldenburg, the Battle of Delfzijl, the Massacre of Nederstricht. Why so many battles? One word: cannons. You no longer needed year-long sieges to take a castle. A couple weeks of cannon fire could flatten any fortification of the day, freeing up time for open-field battles. Cannons gave the biggest advantage to the Von Daun faction, who conducted the most sieges. Amsterdam was successfully besieged during the war, despite having the best fortification in Europe at the time, or at least the best fortifications one could build on a flat plain. Gradually, Dirk started losing more and more land. His war chest ran dry, and it all ended with a defeat at the Battle of Zutphen. The Von Daun faction won, Dirk abdicated, and Bruno finally became emperor. The winners and losers alike, realizing that this kind of war couldn't be the norm, decided to stick around at Zutphen and hash out the empire's future. The result was a legislative document called the Golden Bull of 1399. It had many chapters regulating imperial life, but there were 3 key points. First, only emperors elected by the prince-electors after the previous emperor's death would be considered legitimate. The electors were the 7 most powerful lords at the time: King of Bohemia, King of Frisia, Duke of Tuscany, Duke of Pomerania, Duke of Lombardy, Duke of Luxembourg, and Duke of Carinthia. Other kingdoms, Lotharingia and Bavaria, weren't recognized by the emperors before, so this was a sort of compromise. Bavaria got left out in a funny way. Its kings didn't actually control the Duchy of Bavaria, so they picked Carinthia instead. Second, wars within the empire weren't exactly banned, but they were officially frowned upon. Third, they created the imperial diet, the Reichstag, a forum where electors, clergy, and city representatives debated imperial issues. Without major approval in the Reichstag, the emperor had no right to make reforms, seize lands, or raise an imperial army. The reforms helped, even if they froze the empire's decentralized nature in place. Any imperial use of force would immediately upset all the electors and vassals. Those vassals, meanwhile, didn't mind the small taxes they were now paying, so relative peace followed, at least until the next crisis. And so, the Holy Roman Empire effectively stopped being an empire. The feudal lords turned their ambitions outward, seeking to grow their power through other countries' lands. In the east, a tempting target emerged: Poland, whose king had embraced Cathar heresy and declared himself emperor of the Western Slavs. For the King of Bohemia, both acts were outrageous, and he launched a crusade against them. Around the same time, the Lithuanians rose in revolt, which helped the Crusaders. In the end, Lithuania became an independent noble republic. The Polish Empire was dismantled, and Silesia was split into 2 counties and absorbed into the HRE. Meanwhile, the new king of Frisia, Floris III, wasn't just sitting around. He organized a crusade in Iberia, correctly guessing that things weren't going too great in Jerusalem. Okay, who am I kidding? They would have gone for Jerusalem again, but the latest iteration of that kingdom had survived longer than the previous ones, and was actually still around, even expanding a little. So, the king of the newly created Kingdom of Valencia in 1422 became the nephew of Floris, and Valencia itself became a good base for Frisian merchants in the Mediterranean and a connection point with Byzantium, which in turn was connected to the Silk Road. That's how the logistic chain worked. With Floris' backing, the Valencians launched an expansion into Africa, trying to tap into the trans-Saharan trade. That meant access to gold, ivory, salt, the good stuff. The constant sailing between Frisia and Valencia sparked advances in shipbuilding, and around this time, the popular hulk, a banana-shaped, 3-masted ship, was replaced by the larger, more ocean-worthy carrack. Still kinda banana-shaped, by the way. It used the new flush planking technique and became the dominant ship type for the next century. There was also the need to find a suitable intermediate base between Valencia and Frisia, and such a base was found. They saw that on a 14th century Italian map there was an island in the Atlantic called Isola del Nam, a timber island, because there was a lot of forest there. The Frisians established a base there and translated the name of the island and the whole local archipelago into German. Thus it became known as Hosinsel and became the first Frisian colony. Then they started to cut down forests and dig terraces. Thankfully at least they did not start to make polders, and started to grow wheat there. But then they came up with the idea to bring sugarcane, because sugar was expensive in Europe at the time and was under the Venetian monopoly. And so the island became profitable on its own, no longer being just a supply depot. Moreover, the Frisians liked the idea of colonization so much that they decided to expand their overseas possessions at the expense of other islands: Azores, Green Cape Islands, and Canary Islands, though the latter were under Arab control and had to be fought for. Thus began their first colonial war against local populations. The first of many. Now let's talk about the economy. Starting in the 15th century, the shift from feudalism to capitalism slowly began to take shape. Attitudes toward interest-bearing loans softened, and Italian banks started opening branches all over Europe, using bills of exchange, basically fancy IOUs that acted like money. Soon, local banks started popping up too. This system eventually expanded to commodity trading, and in 1418, Amsterdam saw the opening of the first permanent commodity exchange, the Bourse. It was a wholesale market of pure competition, where people traded in raw materials and standardized goods like metals, grain, wool, timber, livestock, and so on. Later came spices, silk, cotton, tea, and sugar, again. The real kicker of this exchange was that the traders dealt in goods that weren't physically there. Only samples were present, and bills of exchange were perfect for that setup. However, the Bourse didn't even have a proper building for its first 50 years or so. Trading happened in the town square. So yeah, the idea of trading with pieces of paper didn't catch on that fast, considering how long it took them to save up for a building. But hey, no one at the time thought this was some kind of pivot to capitalism. That only became clear like 200 years later. Anyway, in 1442, the then emperor from the Fondao dynasty died. His descendants all kicked the bucket without leaving any heirs, so the electors chose the most worthy candidate for the job, Floris, who became Emperor Floris II. See? No need for coups or rebellions. Just kill off all the emperor's sons. Just kidding. Floris' next actions reflected the change in attitude toward the imperial title. It was no longer some must-have throne that every feudal lord was dying to snatch. It had become more of a prestigious position, with perks and opportunities, but also real limitations. Floris wasted no time seizing such an opportunity. He demanded the excommunicated king of Lotharingia to give up his illegitimate royal title. firstly securing majority support from the Reichstag. Pretty much everyone backed the move. Lotharingia was huge, and its direct vassals included several major duchies in the east that needed cutting down to size. Plus, their king was excommunicated, and by then the church didn't toss those around lightly. As a result, the kingdom was dissolved, although now the Duke of Luxembourg retained the Duchy of Meissen, and Floris at the same time added the Duchy of Dulwich with Aachen to his possessions. He didn't rush to move the capital there, though, and that says a lot about shifting priorities. Now he was the king of Frisia first, and emperor second. The imperial title could be lost, and Aachen wasn't much use if that happened. Amsterdam, on the other hand, was bigger, in a way better strategic spot, and thriving. And in general, the attitude of virtually all rulers toward their possessions also changed. In those days, king and kingdom were inseparable. You could say that when a king dies, his kingdom dies too, and a new kingdom appears in its place immediately, or after a while. It may be the same in territory, or it may be smaller if it was divided between sons. Its politics may change dramatically, or it may not. Today you are king of the Franks, and tomorrow your son is king of France. Lotharingia appeared as a fragment of the empire. Lothar died, and there is no Lotharingia. Feudalism in its purest form, and vassals, as many kings, by the way, had the same attitude to their possessions. But now, with the emergence and spread of much more stable bureaucracy and the acceptance by the majority of the idea of primogeniture, the transfer of all titles to the eldest heir, kingdoms and other feudal formations became much more stable political entities. States, basically. It is no coincidence that the famous phrase, "the king is dead, long live the king," emerged only in the 15th century. It meant that the kingdom itself continued on, even after the monarch's death. Frisia and Bohemia were ahead of the curve on this, on par with or even ahead of the other Western European kingdoms, I'd say. Speaking of Western Europe, there was a shift in relations between England, France and Frisia. England and France still hated each other, no surprises there, but their relations with Frisia basically flipped. England used to supply raw materials, especially wool, and buy finished goods in return. Now they had their own cities with weaving workshops, and became Frisian direct competitors. With France, it was the opposite. For emperors of the HRE, France had always been a thorn in the side, trying to snatch pieces of the empire when no one was looking. But for the kings of Frisia, France wasn't really a threat. Not for now, anyway. Remember, being king of Frisia now took priority over being emperor. Adding the old enemy of my enemy is my friend logic, and you get not exactly an alliance, but definitely a mutually beneficial relationship. That's what led Emperor Dirk IV to approach the King of France with a deal. To help him take Normandy and Brittany from England, they were in a personal union at the time, and in return, France would hand over Flanders to Frisia. Dirk's real target here was Antwerp, a free city allied with and trading heavily with England, and getting very rich from it. France agreed, and in 1458, war broke out. At sea, England and Antwerp held the upper hand early on, thanks to their impressive navy. But the Frisians managed to stop England from landing troops in Normandy. That left England's other ally, Burgundy, facing France and Frisia mostly alone, and they lost hard. Several major defeats followed, including at the hands of Frisia, ended up losing its northern territories. Over the next few years, while fighting continued on land, Frisia built a bigger navy. And once England shifted its main forces to the continent, Dirk led a surprise landing in England, crushed the remaining English troops, and took London. Not that it mattered much. The English were already losing badly in France. They had to accept the loss of their continental holdings and pay reparations. France kept its word and handed over coastal Flanders, which let Frisia blockade Antwerp by sea. And things only got bigger from there. During the war, while the emperor was busy, all the Italian members of the empire started to quietly slip out of the back door. This was obviously a blow to the Holy Roman Empire, which now stopped being Roman, and ended up with a slightly embarrassing addition of the German nation, a label first used by Dirk in his address to the Reichstag. For Dirk though, this was actually a lucky break. First, it meant he could wage war on the Italians over the German lands they took with them, without any major political fallout. And second, it gave him the opportunity to redistribute the two vacant elector titles. One of them went to his relative, the Duke of Savoy, and the other to the Duke of Swabia, in exchange for Brussels. And so, Antwerp found itself completely surrounded, and hit with customs duties that went up to 500% of the goods value. It was, in all but name, a blockade. With no other options, the city was forced to join the Frisian Customs Union, which in this case was basically an annexation, with extra steps. But legally, no one could complain. Something similar happened with the Hanseatic League. By the second half of the 15th century, the Hansa had lost much of its power, and had no choice but to join the Frisian Union, to access overseas goods. Though in their case, the process of full absorption took centuries. And speaking of overseas goods and maritime adventures, let's set the stage. By the 1470s, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine one, had reconquered significant parts of Asia Minor and the Black Sea coast. More importantly, it had reorganized those lands into a properly functioning empire, with an actual bureaucracy, and now controlled the terminus of the overland Silk Road. The Arabs, on the other hand, still held the maritime route. And relations between the more legitimate and the more cosplay Roman empires were far from friendly. Aside from the whole awkward name situation, they also clashed over interests in the Balkans. And let's be honest, no one was thrilled about paying rivals or infidels for Eastern luxuries. Or about paying anyone, really. Relatable. So, an alternative route was needed, and it was found in 1484, when Holland navigator Gabor Kamstra discovered a sea route to the Indian Ocean around Africa. Around the same time, another sailor, Christopher Columbus, proposed a bold plan: sail west to reach India and China. Because, the Earth is round. But the new emperor, Fuller's Desert, turned him down. They already had a southern route. So Columbus went to the Scots, and actually managed to set sail to the Caribbean. But as it turns out, the Scots already knew about the land to the west. They'd been quietly colonizing it and kept the whole thing secret, which was, frankly, a smart move. The rest of the Europe only caught on after 1500, when the Scots started exporting suspiciously large amounts of fish. And that's why America isn't called something like Randolphia. Missed opportunity. That could be funny. But the Scots didn't really worry about whether it was India or not. They just found land and settled it. And the first person to figure out and prove that this wasn't Asia, but an entirely new continent, was Florentine explorer Amerigo Vespucci, who was working for the Frisians and received generous funding for his expeditions. After all, having 2 sea routes to India was alright, but discovering an almost unclaimed continent full of resources, way better. That's how the first Frisian colony in America was founded. They immediately started growing sugarcane there, and later added tobacco, cacao, and cotton. All those warm weather cash crops. And who was going to work the plantations? Slaves, obviously. The local population, whom the Frisians met and pretty quickly started fighting, weren't ideal for forced labor. They didn't really get the whole farming thing, and had to be trained. Plus they knew about the local terrain and could just run away. But where they were easily available was in Africa, where the locals were happy to sell numerous captives taken in wars. In addition to slaves, the Frisians were interested in gold and ivory, which was gaining popularity in Europe. Also good commodities for exchange. For comfortable trade and logistics, the Frisians bought land and built, or seized from the Africans, several outposts along the ocean. And there they began to deal with the locals, offering in exchange the already widespread gunpowder weapons, alcohol, and textiles. That's how the triangle trade came into being. A very profitable venture for the traders of the time. By making a full cycle of Europe, Africa, America, Europe, one could get about 500% profit for a year. Such were the startups of their time. Soon, other Europeans joined the Frisians and the Scots in these ventures. Basically anyone with a coastline, from the Norwegians to the Spanish. And you could even argue the Spanish were more successful in the early days of colonization than the Netherlands. After all, they managed to conquer wealthy, already densely populated Mexico. I mean, who would have thought you could take over an entire massive region with just 1,000 soldiers? If I were an investor back then, I never would have bet on that. But they just showed up and, pretty much by accident, conquered it. Then it happened again, this time in South America. But now it was the French who pulled off the conquest of Peru. Meanwhile, the regions sold their exotic goods mainly to the HRE and Eastern Europe, because the huge Slavic and German market had no alternative suppliers, except for Mecklenburg and Pomerania, which had access to the sea and also joined the colonial race. To better control access to their top customers, Poland and Rus, who also happened to be key suppliers of raw materials like timber, tar, hemp, potash, and of course, grain. The Frisians needed to dominate the Baltic Sea. The ideal place for projecting power in the region was the island of Gotland, which at the time belonged to Sweden, a country in eastern Scandinavia and a rival to Denmark, which, conveniently, was an ally of Frisia. 1 + 1 = war, and in 1511, Frisia launched the conflict. But it didn't stop with Sweden. Sweden had an alliance with Scotland, who jumped in, which meant they became weak, and England took the opportunity to attack Scotland. And then France, seeing England distracted, attacked Burgundy. Classic domino effect. In the end, the attackers got what they wanted and grew stronger, while the losers, well, grew weaker. Frisia got Gotland, and with it, control of the Baltic. Later on, they even convinced the Danes to drop tolls through the Danish Straits. By the time of that war, the Frisians had already opened up a route to India, and even completed a circumnavigation of the globe. They were slowly pushing into Indonesia, China and Japan, beating out local and Arab merchants thanks to better ships and cannons. At first, they dabbled in speculation and piracy, not in any rush to actually bring the goods like silk and spices back to Europe. But eventually, they set up a supply hub at the edge of the Cape of Good Hope and named it after the cape, Kapstadt. From there, they started buying ports and setting up trading posts in Asia. In India, it was Calicut, a spice and cotton hotspot. That cotton eventually replaced British wool in the European textile industry. In Japan, they set up in Fukuoka, where they bought silver, which they used to trade with China, for goods and weapons. In China, they acquired Guangzhou. Yes, the Guangzhou, the largest city in southern China, where they bought silk and porcelain with gold and silver. Despite the steep price, it was a killer long-term investment. The Chinese only agreed to the deal because at the time the region was in the middle of a civil war, and its rulers from the Kingdom of Wu desperately needed cash and were afraid of losing the city. Thanks to the Frisian money, they actually won the war in southern China, and after that, they weren't too eager to break the deal. They had no idea just how strong these new barbarians really were, and they hadn't managed to reunite all of China yet. An attack from the rear was still a very real threat. But of course, the main stage for Frisian trade expansion was Indonesia, a source of all kinds of spices and a patchwork of small tribes and principalities constantly at odds with each other. Perfect spot for a takeover. They first conquered the Moluccas, which produced cloves and nutmeg, and then set up their sights on a bigger prize, the island of Celebes, a key source of timber and food for their trading posts. After that, they seized the ports of Malacca from the local sultanate and conquered the port of Banten, effectively taking control of the crucial straits that led into Indonesia and China, and slapped massive tolls on anyone passing through. Thanks to this, they became a trade monopolist in East Asia for quite a while. At the same time, back in Europe, new social, political, economic and cultural shifts were bubbling up under one common name: the Reformation of the Catholic Church. This led to the creation of new branches of Christianity and a separate denomination, Protestantism. It's a complex topic, not something you can cover in a flash. But in short, Protestantism in Germany owed its success to the rising bourgeoisie and the rulers themselves. They were the ones who had built up grievances against the Catholic Church. The townspeople wanted to read the Bible in their own language and stop paying church taxes that went toward extravagant rituals and opulent church decor. Plus, the church still frowned on lending money for interest. The rulers, on the other hand, wanted to chip away at the Pope's and the Emperor's authority, and, of course, grab those juicy church lands. Let's dive into that part a bit more. I already mentioned that after the Little Interregnum, the church had lost most of its land, and stopped being a major feudal power. But during the Great Interregnum, the clergy started expanding their holdings again. Here's how it worked. Princes needed mercenaries for their increasingly large wars, and that meant money. Credit wasn't really a thing yet, and the only ones swimming in cash were the clergy, thanks to the tithes and indulgence sales. So they bought land on the cheap from these princes. And by the 16th century, monasteries were once again major landowners. That's the land the rulers wanted to claw back. And of course, pretty much every social class, including the clergy, had issues with indulgences. Paying for forgiveness kind of flies in the face of Christianity's whole thing about it being hard for the rich to enter heaven. But our focus is on Phrygia. What was happening there? Well, all those same trends were present, just in much milder form, which is kind of surprising for such a bourgeois society. There wasn't much church-owned land in Phrygia, because their kings already had plenty of money and didn't need to sell off their holdings. The church behaved itself relatively politely, and didn't go wild with indulgence sales. After all, the king of Phrygia, at the time Philip II, was also the Holy Roman Emperor, and his relations with the Pope was just fine. Still, the core ideas of the Reformation wasn't alien to Phrygia, so the initial reaction there was pretty neutral. Translating and printing the Bible in German was allowed, but popular movements like Lutheranism didn't really catch on as separate denominations. That is, until Philip found himself with reasons to start reconsidering his confessional alignment. The root cause was the colonization of America. It all started in 1536, when a group of Frisian Protestants decided to move, just in case, to the sparsely populated North America and set up a colony there, wanting to live in peace and not bother anyone. Philip wanted to show he didn't condemn them and even help them financially. That's how Phrygia got its first colony in North America. Then, 3 years later, the Pope divided North America and the Caribbean between Scotland and Spain, and from that point on, no other country was allowed to settle there. Phrygia already had colonies in the Caribbean, so that alone was a challenge to the Pope's authority, something Philip considered absurd, and no one was going to give up on colonization. Thus, relations with the Pope soured. Around that time, a new branch of Protestantism appeared, Reformed theology, which was even more radical than mainstream Lutheranism. The bourgeoisie and townsfolk like its asceticism and strict discipline, good for keeping people working harder, and also its democratic approach to church governance, meaning no bishops needed. It also had some core beliefs that really set it apart. For instance, the idea that God had already predestined who would go to heaven. Makes sense, since he's omnipotent and omniscient, sovereign, immutable. Oh, how sweet it is to be a god. But it's also kind of depressing. Why do we even bother eating that damn apple? This determinism meant that your faith would naturally push you to do good deeds, and thus prove your salvation, unlike other confessions that said your actions and faith bring salvation. Anyway, then Philip found out that the prince-electors, wary of Phrygia's growing power, planned to elect the Duke of Carinthia as the next emperor. He was also the Archduke of Austria, though at that point he was more like the King of Croatia, since Bohemia had taken over Austria. That's when Philip hatched a plan: officially convert to Reformed Protestantism, provoke the electors into choosing a new emperor, and since emperors can only be elected after the previous one dies, that would give him an excuse to subjugate the electors. But he died just a few months after switching confessions, and the new king of Phrygia became Dirk V, the third of that name. And he didn't abandon either Reformed Protestantism or the imperial title. So began a period of dual power, which in practice changed nothing, since none of the major princes supported Dirk, not even the Lutheran ones, and so he didn't act on it. Well, except that he refused to protect these little princes from external invasions. And with Frisia no longer officially responsible for defending the empire, it started getting slowly nipped away by France and Byzantium. But Dirk got plenty of other things done. First, he launched a reform of titles and administration. The state was now officially called the Kingdom of the Lowlands, Nederlanden, which is pretty accurate if you look at the topographic map, though the name Frisia is still used informally. The country was now divided into regions under the control of governors, to whom local elected city officials reported. The main goal was to build and maintain a standing regular army and navy, as well as a network of hilltop fortresses, which they could now afford. Dirk was also the one who convinced Denmark to drop tolls for Frisian ships. He invested in new canals, polders and dikes, which could be destroyed in the event of an invasion, to flood the enemy pass, all of which, combined with the fortresses, made for an excellent defense system. He also put money into education, funding new universities and printing houses, like the House of Elsevier, which printed small portable books. That helped establish the Netherlands as the most educated country in Europe. He also created a grant system to hire top-tier artists and scholars. This ushered in the peak of the Frisian Renaissance, as part of the broader Northern Renaissance. The key difference from the Italian version was its focus not on Christian or classical themes in pretty packaging, but on everyday life and society. And of course, humanism wasn't foreign to the Frisians either. They were heavily influenced by the teachings of Erasmus. Ideas about reason, making us human, about free will, the importance of intellectual and moral education for children, and protecting kids from violence as a form of discipline. A lot of that contradicted Reformed theology, but apparently they weren't too bothered by the contradictions. Religious tolerance was familiar territory for them too. Back to Dirk, for example. Despite being a pretty zealous follower of Reformed Protestantism himself, he never tried to force it on others. In fact, he signed the Act of Toleration, which banned persecution based on religious beliefs. Thanks to that, while Europe was being torn apart by religious unrest, persecutions and uprisings, the Netherlands became a place of relative safety, attracting all sorts of people, usually quite rich or educated. Rulers like Dirk usually end up being called Great. And yeah, he got that nickname too. But great rulers tend to rise in great times. And Dirk was no exception, because we are now approaching the so-called Frisian Golden Age, when roughly half the world, in one way or another, was working for their prosperity. And we are back in Asia, because that's where most of the money was coming from at the time. By the second half of the 16th century, the number of trading posts held by Frisian merchants had grown. To the ones I already mentioned were added places like Calcutta in the Bengal Delta, a port in Ceylon, and more, all owned by different trading companies that naturally competed with each other. And since the spice trade back then was a seller's market, demand far outpaced supply, that kind of competition could lead to prices dropping and foreign companies gaining ground. So in 1565, the Landtag proposed merging all the companies into one, and Dirk backed the idea. That's how the Vereinigte Ostindien Company, the United East India Company, was born, or just VOK. Doesn't sound like they spent too long naming it. Nowadays, that would have been called a trust, corporate trust, and slapped with antitrust regulations. But back then, life was simpler, and capitalism was more capitalist. In fact, monopolizing Asian trade was kind of the whole point, since the bulk of the profits from spices and other luxuries came from foreign buyers. Yep. And just like in every evil corporation trope, they had their own army, the right to make laws, declare war, and govern conquered territories. And they answered only to the king. Basically, it was a state within a state. To make sure all the merchants and burghers who'd been merged into this new mega company knew who owned what, they introduced a system of shares, pieces of paper giving you a right to a portion of the profits, and some say in company decisions. Those shares were soon freely traded at the Amsterdam Bourse, which then split off from the commodities exchange and became the world's first modern stock market. Another innovation was the Fluid, a ship designed to carry lots of cargo with a small crew, featuring a pear-shaped stern for better handling and a shallow draft so it could easily sail into low-depth ports like Amsterdam. They were built in standardized shipyards to cut costs and speed up production. Fluids made shipping even easier and became VOK's calling card, and VOK, in turn, became the engine of the Golden Age. Back to Europe, where the money flowed. By the 1570s, religious tensions in the empire reached their peak, and the Protestants formed an alliance called the Evangelical Union, led by Denmark, because no one wanted a reformed Protestant leading it, and Dirk still hadn't dropped his claim to the imperial crown, which nobody wanted to deal with at the time. Dirk even thought about leaving the Union, but they secured backing from Byzantium and Rus, which made Frisian involvement kind of optional and not at all necessary. The Union was meant to defend against the Catholics, who then formed their own league supported by Poland, Spain, Valencia and Carthage. And since the best defense is a good offense, the War of the Leagues broke out in 1577. Overall, the Protestants had the upper hand, especially after France jumped in and attacked Catholic Luxembourg, while everyone else was distracted. But while that seems obvious in hindsight, it wasn't at the time, and the war dragged on for 6 years, killing millions, mostly civilians, of course. In the end, the Protestants got what they wanted. The twin peace treaties, collectively known as the Peace of Westphalia, established equal rights for Catholics and Protestants, and the Protestant countries picked up a few territorial gains. The Netherlands, for example, got some Spanish colonies and a sliver of Luxembourg. And so the Holy Roman Empire stopped being holy. Europe entered a period of relative peace, and the Frisians, well, they came out of the war having realized that fighting over land in Europe wasn't exactly profitable. The only real expansion they did after that was basically walking in and annexing Nassau in 1622 without a fight. And without wars, there is not much drama to tell. Though hey, that's around the time potatoes showed up. And thanks to their hardiness in cold climates, they started taking roots nicely. Anyway, let's head back to Asia. The VOK kept expanding its holdings. By the second half of the 17th century, they had completely taken over the islands of Celebes and Ceylon, grabbed big chunks of the Bay of Bengal coastline and southwestern India, bought the port of Bangkok, colonized Formosa thanks to the Chinese migrants settling there, conquered half of the Philippines, Sumatra and Java. And on Java, by the way, they built what would become the company's future administrative center, the city of Batavia. They also claimed a good piece of Brunei. In short, more than half of the Malay archipelago was under VOK control. With such massive territories, several times larger than the mother country, they decided to make the most profitable move at the time: grow spices. Sounds smart, right? Well, here's the catch. They didn't quite factor in the limited number of spice consumers. There is only so much spice a person can eat, after all. And they poured almost all their money into developing plantations, which eventually turned the spice market into a buyer's market. Supply was way above demand, and prices dropped like a stone. And well, it wasn't a total disaster in itself. Spices could still be used as preservatives, for example. But the company had bet on prices staying sky high, and their profit expectations were built on that assumption. So when the prices plummeted, the whole operation started looking like a very expensive mistake. Honestly, it's kind of like the modern problem with the flood of live service games that no one asked for, just for a reference. Next, they tried to artificially jack up prices, burning down spice warehouses, switching to other crops, but smugglers from rival countries had already bought up tons of spice for cheap. Therefore, in the short term, the plan failed. In the long run, it didn't help either, because other European, and not only European powers, began developing their own spice sources. The VOK was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, and only state intervention in the form of loans kept them afloat. Now the state had a very practical concern: finding new source of income. The solution? Expanding the monopoly. by merging with other companies from other countries, particularly Britain. The plan? Well, to put it bluntly, conquer it. So let's rewind about 100 years. After Frisia adopted Reformed Protestantism, its relationship with Valencia took a nosedive, and England became Valencia's new BFF. The von Aven dynasty was still ruling in Valencia, and after a sequence of dynastic marriages and the childless end of the old Normandy line, descendants of William the Conqueror, by the way, the von Aven ended up on the English throne. Now let's go back. Forward. In 1652, Philip III became King of the Netherlands. With France and Spain busy bashing each other, he seized the moment. He won over some English parliamentarians who weren't exactly thrilled with the then King Adam's leadership, and who were quite thrilled with Frisian cash and the prospect of trading benefits. So Philip declared his claim to the British crown, and personally led the invasion the very next year. Along with Valencia, Britain was supported by Mecklenburg and Pomerania. The Netherlands had Denmark on their side. That's where most of the regional scuffles happened, plus a little bit in the Americas. But the real action was in England. The Frisians had total naval dominance, so landing 70,000 troops in Essex was a walk in the park. Philip led most of his army straight to London, and entered it without a fight. He sent another force to Kent, as bait. The loyalists took the bait and got themselves into a trap. Their losses weren't massive, but the whole thing left them disorganized. That led to another defeat near Norfolk, and reinforcements headed for London got encircled and wiped out, so the loyalists had to retreat north. Southern England fell under Philip's control. Then he marched on and took Chester without resistance. The English tried to retake it, while part of their army, led by King Adam himself, headed south. Philip, clearly channeling his inner William the Conqueror, pursued him all the way to Cornwall, where they had a very non-decisive battle. Adam managed to escape. Meanwhile, Philip sent most of his troops back to Chester, where the Frisians won again. Then came another battle, and another, and another. The English just wouldn't give up. Only by 1657, after a complete defeat, did they finally recognize Philip as King of United Kingdom, and thus he earned himself the nickname the Conqueror. The Netherlands also got a few territorial concessions from Pomerania and Mecklenburg. And with the Netherlands and Britain now united, nobody else wanted to mess with them. Too risky. As for the Frisian bourgeoisie, they got exactly what they were after. The merger of the VOK and the EIC, the East India Company. That meant extra manpower and resources, and the colonial machine kept rolling. They finished conquering Java, among other things, but over time the company started shifting focus to more stable sources of income, stuff like cotton, tea and coffee. Speaking of coffee, at the time, the Netherlands' main rival in the Indian Ocean was Yemen, a large Arab empire that had conquered East Africa, owned a fair number of overseas possessions, captured or purchased European ships, and rebuilt its fleet in their image. By the 1690s, the Frisians finally decided to deal with them. After defeating the Yemeni main fleet at the very beginning of the war, the Frisians began occupying islands, while the Arabs resorted to raiding trade ships in small groups. The war might have dragged on like that indefinitely, had the Frisians not landed in the Horn of Africa, smashed the Yemeni corps stationed here, and then promptly sailed off again, sending a clear message that they were capable of threatening the Yemeni heartland at will. As a result, Yemen gave up all its oceanic colonies. And as it happened, the Frisians found coffee beans in the baggage train of the defeated Arabs, gave it a try, liked it, and then discovered plantations on the conquered islands. They brought the stuff back to Europe, and people there like it too. And so, in 1699, a coffee house opened in Amsterdam. Not the first in Europe, they already existed in Venice and Constantinople. But being the most globalized country of the era, it was in the Netherlands where coffee truly became a trend. Coffee became an important attribute of intellectuals and the coming age of enlightenment, as coffee houses were a medium of intellectual exchange, and coffee itself as a drink invigorates and promotes thinking, unlike alcohol. From that moment, thanks to the development of scientific and technological progress and accumulated knowledge, Europe was already noticeably ahead of other continents, and their dominance began to grow quite rapidly. And the Netherlands was one of the engines of this progress and preparation for the Industrial Revolution. I would even say the main one. The operational steam engine was invented there, and then improved, the coke furnace, spinning lathe, swing plow, and so on. Plus industrialization was going fastest there. But during the Enlightenment, not only scientific, but also social and political thoughts developed, like the demand for abolition of slavery. The slave trade had already been outlawed in the previous century, but actual emancipation didn't come until the 1740s, when slavery was no longer as profitable as wage labor. After all, it's hard to trust a slave with an expensive steel plow. Plus, it was nice to justify their supposed devotion to humanism. There was also calls for universal public education, which was introduced in the 1710s, though it remained voluntary and urban-focused for over a century. And finally, there were demands for constitution and broader participation in governance. So, how was the Frisian state governed in the early 18th century? In many ways, it was your typical absolutist, bureaucratic, centralized monarchy of the era, based on the principle that the state is the ruler. The king's decisions were absolute, and the bureaucracy merely carried out his will. But unlike other European states, where the bureaucracy was mostly staffed by aristocrats, here anyone could join by passing an exam. Universities and trade schools offer grants to talented students from poor families. And generally speaking, when trade and urban manufacturing brought in way more tax revenue than agriculture, it was unnecessary to care about the gentry's interests. So the system worked like this. At a small level, such as cities and rural communities, the elected self-government continued to operate. And at the level of real power, the meritocracy operated, saying that you can do what you want in your municipality, but smart guys will manage the fate of the country. Of course, it looked pretty neat on paper, but no exam can accurately check the competence of a future official, especially when the exam itself could not change for years. So, smart guys were not always such. They were most often the younger sons of the rich. And grants for the poor were more like grants for the middle class, because before entering the university, you had to study at school somehow, and not work from childhood. But well, at least they had something. There was also a Landtag, with representatives from the bourgeoisie, townsfolk and peasants. It had mechanisms and procedures that forced the king to listen to its proposals and complaints, meaning the monarch couldn't just wall himself off in an echo chamber. That is, an adequate king had all the tools of competent management of the country, and therefore as long as he could at least listen, the established system worked well, and there were no outright terrible kings in the Netherlands. Yet. Meet Dirk VIII. In 1714, he became king of the Netherlands and of the United Kingdom, and promptly decided to fully merge the two states. The idea was quite doable. Britain was a union by nature, and after 50 years of rule from across the sea, London had more or less gotten used to having a monarch on the continent, especially since it was only a day's journey to Amsterdam. So, said and done. Dirk bribed the English Parliament and declared himself Emperor of the United Crowns. Yeah, weird name. But United Kingdom was already taken. And then came the question, what to do with Parliament? If everything stayed the same, there wouldn't be much point to the unification. Dirk's solution was simple: dissolve it. His advisors, however, explained this was a bad idea and would cause serious unrest on the islands. They even suggested expanding Parliament to include the Netherlands, also not a bad idea, but Dirk was unyielding. He went to London to announce his decision personally. Before that, though, the lords requested a private audience to try to talk him out of it. There, he tried English cuisine, choked, and died. Just kidding, he choked on tea. Or so claimed those who were present. Naturally, everyone was shocked, and realizing they'd be blamed for the emperor's sudden death, and he died young and childless, they panicked. So, at the parliament session that had been called to announce its dissolution, they instead proclaimed the formation of the United Republic, Thus, in October 1714, began the strange revolution. A revolution that no one really wanted, yet it happened anyway. And as it usually goes with things that have no real support, it didn't last long, less than a year, in fact. By August, royalist forces, led by Christian von Haaren, marched into Amsterdam and declared the monarchy restored. The crown was offered to Alfred von Aven, Duke of Hanover and cousin of Dirk, who accepted without much hesitation. A week later, the same happened in Britain, where a distant relative of Adam was crowned king. Still, in the nearly year-long lifespan of the Republic, the Republicans managed to do a few things. For one, they wrote a constitution and expanded the parliament, specifically the elected House of Commons, to include the Netherlands. Alfred decided to keep that, although he trimmed its powers and introduced a property requirement of 10,000 guldens, basically the cost of a nice canal-side house in Amsterdam, so only the very wealthy could vote. They also merged English and Frisian Louisiana under a single administration, which after the restoration sided with the Netherlands, much to the Britain's annoyance. Thus, 50 years of relatively peaceful coexistence were forgotten in an instant, and the two were back to being rivals. Another new rival, by the way, was Denmark, now called Scandinavia, which had unified the region and decided that the Frisians and British were making just a bit too much money in the Baltic. So they reinstated tolls on the straits. The Frisians replied by digging the Kiel Canal and sailed through that instead. In general, pretty much every European coastal country had a growing list of grievances against the Frisians. The main one being, why are you so damn rich? And after the break with Britain, they finally got a chance to voice those grievances, with guns. On the Netherlands side stood their longtime allies Rus, Valencia, with whom relations had been restored once everyone stopped caring about confessional differences, and Bohemia, whose kings at the same time were also emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. And since after the British incident, Alfred decided that he did not need empty claims to the imperial crown, and renounced them, ending a rather conditional 160-year period of dual power, thus improving relations with Bohemia. And the latter, interested in maintaining the status quo, came to the defense of the Netherlands. So in 1716 began a war that some called the First World War, since fighting took place on every continent. This actually worked in the Netherlands' favor, because in the colonies their forces performed better than in Europe. Not that things in Europe were going badly. They had enough troops and fortresses to fend off France and Scandinavia, mostly France. But launching offensives was off the table. Gradually, countries started dropping out. First was Spain, where a native uprising broke out in Mexico, and which, in exchange for peace, ceded half of its Caribbean territories. Then Scandinavia, which gave up a small patch of land around the Great Lakes. Then Byzantium, where hostilities simply stopped because of internal issues. And finally France, which after 3 years of intense war simply ran out of money and agreed to peace, ceding their holdings in the Philippines and in Guyana. So yeah, looks like the Netherlands came out of this war as the winner. However, as you might have noticed, the concessions were more symbolic than truly substantial, because the Netherlands didn't exactly want to piss off its neighbors too much. They already had plenty on their plate. First, the war had consumed a vast amount of resources, with the Netherlands being the largest spender among both sides of the conflict. Second, the United Kingdom withdrew from the Union and actually benefited from that war, taking over parts of the VOK holdings and conquering a piece of Central America, where spices could also be cultivated. By that time, the seeds had already been stolen. So VOK permanently lost its main source of income and was in trouble again. I'd say they were not okay. And they had to be rescued with new government loans. The money, as usual, was planned to get from the newly conquered colonies, by taxing the local population and imposing tariffs on production, forcing them to sell raw materials and buy finished products. And it worked. Britain did the same thing. So throughout the 18th century, both powers took piece after piece from the Telangana Empire, of which by the next century there was nothing left. However, the VOK's core issues, mismanagement and corruption, persisted, with executives awarding themselves generous bonuses for unclear achievements, and paying dividends to investors instead of investing in the business, deepening the company's debts. only in 1750, when VOK again came to the government for money. The latter said that trust had broken down, and all the loans issued would be used to buy the company's shares. And given the VOK's plummeting market value, this effectively nationalized the company. The government then took charge and decided to restructure it, as the idea of maintaining a trading monopoly was no longer viable. The VOK's domain was broken into two major governorates, India and Malaya, run by government-appointed governors, along with smaller ones like Guangzhou, and company assets such as plantations and mines were auctioned off. Now let's return to Enlightened Europe, where during the Enlightenment, under the influence of new ideas about the state of universal equality and other nonsense, and strengthening the power of monarchs, the process of discontent of large masses of the population began to boil up. And the more exhausted from wars and abuse of the monarch's absolute power, primarily taxation, it was, the greater the risk of revolution this monarch was under. The first dam burst in Byzantium, just about this problem during the war I was talking about. The emperor was executed, and in 1726 the Roman Republic was proclaimed there. European monarchs reacted rather coolly to this news, because Byzantium all the time stood apart from Europe. Although the very idea that the monarch can be so simply executed at the will of the crowd and then the latter will live happily ever after was dangerous. They are anointed by God, after all. Rus was the first to act, and together with the Netherlands they began an invasion operation to restore the monarchy in 1732. Frisians had to repeat events of the Second Crusade, that this capture of Constantinople was again not enough for a victory. Moreover, the first attempt of landing has been unsuccessful. But then armies of Greeks have gone on the north and they have thrown capital, hoping on the fleet. But it has suffered defeat directly in Marmara Sea. Frisians have entered Constantinople and further followed long war against dispersed armies of Greeks and occupation of the country, which has come to the end in 1738. By results of the peace treaty, the emperors returned in Byzantium, and for help in destruction of Republic, Rus received northern Black Sea coast, and the Netherlands gained island of Cyprus and port in Iraq. Fair enough. Subsequently, the Netherlands suppressed uprisings in the smaller principalities of the Holy Roman Empire, which were placed under Frisian vassalage to prevent further revolutions. 10 years later, a new large-scale European war began, because France and Spain were still not satisfied with the power of the Netherlands. And since the latter were then busy with a big war against Persia, Telangana, Khitans and Nepal. However, it did not affect the outcome of the European war, and the coalition again lost. This time the colonies were taken away from France, which had lost all of Tasmania. But the victory did not cancel the huge damage from the war in material and human resources, which had to be replenished somewhere. In addition, the 18th century was a century of growing protectionism and increasing tariffs, when the state ability to control trade became sufficient, and unlike earlier tariffs aimed at making profit, these duties were aimed at supporting their own production, according to the principle of exporting more than importing. The Netherlands were already selling more than they were buying, so it adhered to the principles of free trade. But the duties of other European countries hit their exports hard, which hit production, which hit the Bank of Amsterdam, which as usual had to be rescued by the government. They'd already squeezed Asia dry. But in Americas, where the Netherlands now held huge colonies thanks to war and aggressive colonization, people were living almost autonomously. They'd formed their own settler culture and paid almost no taxes to the metropole. And the government saw these colonies as the next source of revenue. However, 10 years of unsuccessful negotiations led to a war for independence in North America. The Netherlands government chose to solve this problem with force, but underestimated the colony's capacity to mobilize and equip troops. They deployed just 70,000 soldiers, who, after early successes in South, were eventually overwhelmed by 120,000 colonial troops, defeated and captured. Realizing the juice wasn't worth the squeeze, the Frisians recognized American independence and promptly signed an alliance with the newly formed United States, maintaining access to important cotton and tobacco supplies. Having learned from this failure, the Frisians lowered taxes, stationed loyalist garrisons from the metropole, and granted remaining colonies the right to self-govern. Similar processes were taking place in the colonies of other states, but there things moved more slowly, and fights for independence only began during the Napoleonic Wars, when the metropoles were weakened. This resulted in the Frisian colonies being the only European ones left in the Americas, except for Newfoundland. In the case of France, the flame of discontent ignited even in the metropole, and was fueled by the remnants of feudalism and its massive noble privileges, which led to the French Revolution that ended with the king's execution and the establishment of the French Republic in 1790. This time, the Netherlands reacted much more quickly. The revolution had happened right on their doorstep, and within a few months they launched an invasion. But almost immediately, things started to go wrong. Firstly, no one supported the Netherlands, since everyone assumed they would manage on their own. They had managed with Byzantium, after all. Secondly, after a series of major battles along the border, which had generally been more successful for the Frisians, their calculations assumed that the French forces would soon be exhausted. But they weren't. It turned out that the French had come up with a rather revolutionary idea for army recruitment: mass conscription, or libye en masse. The concept that an ordinary person, a citizen, should kill and die for their country because they had some rights within it was alien to post-feudal Europe, where such matters were left to the nobility and mercenaries, or regular army, whose upkeep was quite expensive, and thus limited the state's military capacity. Now, to equip an army, all the French needed was to give a soldier food, optionally, a uniform, and a musket. And by that time, all of these could be produced in sufficient quantities, allowing for the creation of massive armies, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The Netherlands, which had always relied on its wealth to avoid losing wars, now faced a new kind of army that overwhelmed them with sheer numbers, and they began to lose. It was 3 years into the war that other European powers realized the threat and formed a coalition. But by then it was too late for the Netherlands, and the war-weary Frisians agreed to a peace settlement, ceding an entire left bank of the Rhine to the French, and threatening to break the dikes and flood everything if they went further. And so, throughout the Revolutionary Wars and most of the Napoleonic Wars, the Netherlands chose not to participate, focusing instead on further conquest in Asia, allowing France to continue its domination of Europe. Even when, in 1806, Napoleon dissolved the Holy Roman Empire and Bohemia responded by founding the Empire of Great Moravia, the Frisians did nothing, and so the Holy Roman Empire stopped being. However, when Napoleon was assassinated in 1809 and his sphere of influence began to crumble, the Netherlands quickly assembled a new coalition and declared war on France. By that time, all the great powers had adopted the system of mass conscription. Not that the rights of their subjects had greatly increased in the meantime, but there was nothing to be done. This had become the new standard for meat grinding. Yet, even without Napoleon, the war lasted another 4 years, and in April 1814, the Prague Congress took place. It redrew the map of Europe and awarded the Netherlands the territory of former Luxembourg. Nevertheless, the Napoleonic Wars were a cold shower for the Netherlands, and for the German states as a whole, because after the dissolution of the HRE, they realized they were surrounded by national states and empires, while they remained a collection of independent polities that had regarded each other with indifference at best only a short time before, and were now forced to unite, or be devoured by their neighbors. For instance, if it hadn't been for the Napoleonic Wars, Bavaria would likely still be under Bohemian control. Austria and Tyrol were still under Czech rule, and the Northern Alps and Venice were part of Italy. The Netherlands were likely safe. They were a great power. But the same couldn't be said with confidence about the other duchies and principalities. Gradually, the Germans began to recognize that they were Germans, not Pomeranians, Frisians, Bavarians or Franconians, and that they would be better off united than under someone else's rule. Thus, German nationalists began to emerge, and the process of unification around the Netherlands began, since it was obvious to all that they were the strongest and richest German state. But such things don't happen in 1 year, and someone has to make the first move. Rulers rarely give up power voluntarily. And the unification began with the economy, when in 1819, The government of Netherlands remembered how, back in the 16th century, the rulers of Frisia had used tariffs to force cities and principalities to give up part of their sovereignty, and decided to unite the economies of all German states into one, through a customs and monetary union, luring them in with promises of security, only to later pressure them with the threat of exclusion. Thus, the Zollverein was born, which translates from German as the customs union. Most of the German principalities joined it within a few years, mainly the states bordering France, and Pomerania with Mecklenburg, which were already economically dependent on the Netherlands after losing their colonies and the deterioration of relations with Scandinavia. While the larger and less Frisia-influenced Bavaria and Saxony weren't in much of a hurry to join, understanding what tighter economic ties could potentially lead to. So in the end they had to be dragged into the Zollverein by force, literally. In 1827 the Netherlands launched an intervention in Saxony, justified by the claim of compensating a Frisian merchant whose shop in Dresden had been confiscated for underpaying taxes. And France took Saxony's side, rightly fearing German unification. But they still hadn't really recovered from the Napoleonic Wars, and their absolute monarchy didn't have the conscience or the brains to mobilize. So after Saxony capitulated and France suffered a series of heavy defeats on the border, the French agreed to a treaty, recognizing the Netherlands' right to unify Germany. Bavaria, seeing how things were going, realized no one would protect them, and voluntarily joined the Zollverein. And so the German part of Germany was economically unified. Political unification also took time. Since the Netherlands didn't dare to forcibly unify everyone into a single state, they had to negotiate with each prince about how much sovereignty to surrender to the central government and how that central government would function. In the end, they agreed on a federation with elements of a confederation, primarily the latter being reflected in the regional basis of army recruitment in peacetime. Legislative power belonged to the Reichstag, an elected lower chamber of parliament with the same 10,000 gulden property qualification as in the Netherlands Landtag. But after 100 years of inflation and rising general wealth, about a third of the male population now met that requirement. Though now for every 10,000 guldens one owned, one received an extra vote, which of course left the power firmly in the hands of the rich, who is a significant skew toward the Netherlands, since there were more wealthy people there. There was also an upper chamber, the Bundesrat, where each German state had a set number of appointed delegates. At the time of the treaty there were 16 total, and the Netherlands held 26 of them, and this number grew as the borders of the new state expanded. The Bundesrat also served as an executive body. Budgeting, foreign policy, customs regulations, reforms all fell under its jurisdiction, plus each principality could still pass its own local laws. That's how the future German state was structured. But the Netherlands weren't satisfied with just the lands of the German states. They wanted to unite all Germans, which meant war against Scandinavia, Great Moravia and Italy, and that war indeed came in 1837. They didn't bother with subtlety. In January, the United Coalition of German States demanded that all their neighbors give up territories inhabited by Germans, which predictably was refused. Moreover, Britain supported their opponents, while the Germans were backed by Rus, though their involvement wasn't all that necessary, since the Netherlands had already achieved such a tactical and technological advantage that they could have steamrolled everyone on their own. Thanks to improvements in firearms, skirmisher-style mobile infantry began to replace line infantry, and advancements in artillery once again shifted warfare into the realm of material resources. Whoever had more guns and shells, capable of obliterating line infantry, held the upper hand. This of course cost a fortune, but it was effective. So the war went smoothly for the Germans, and in the German-speaking lands they occupied, they were even welcomed as liberators. And within a year and a half they achieved complete victory, taking from their enemies all territories with a significant German-speaking population, and triumphantly crowning Dirk as Emperor of the Germans in Prague. Thus, the German Empire was born, the future hegemon of Europe, and later the world. But this hegemony was built gradually, even though at that point they had already defeated everyone in Europe. First, the Germans needed money to industrialize the entire country, since at the time only the Netherlands was truly industrialized. And that meant, right, new colonial wars. This time the target was China. Trade with China over the past centuries had consisted of exchanging Chinese goods for gold and silver, which the Netherlands obtained by selling their own goods in Africa, Mexico and Peru. In other words, China was the biggest beneficiary of this trade, although in the end it led to a massive inflation and poverty in non-coastal regions, where the imported precious metals never reached. Anyway, the Germans wanted to balance this trade and found a product that could interest the picky Chinese consumer: opium poppies, grown on plantations in Indonesia, which by then was entirely owned by the Netherlands. So essentially they wanted to sell drugs to the Chinese. Although from the perspective of capitalists at the time, this was considered slightly more moral than today, since opium was still legal in the metropole. It's just due to cultural traits, the Chinese were constantly chewing or smoking something, and smoking opium from a pipe fit perfectly with their sense of ceremonies, making them much more susceptible to addiction. The Chinese government, in turn, didn't want to turn the country into a den of addicts, so it closed its borders. In response, the Germans launched an intervention in China in 1840 to reopen them. The Chinese got scared and reopened their market almost without a fight, while also giving the Germans a port in Shandong, Qingdao, Cambodia and access to investments in China, mainly in tea plantations, which the Chinese fairly quickly curtailed. But the production of opium grew rapidly. Within 10 years, volumes had increased fivefold. And then the Germans began realizing the project to build a canal across the Isthmus of Suez, which cut travel time from Amsterdam to, say, Batavia by 40%, and with the advent of steamships even more, from 7 months to 2. But to dig a canal through Suez, they had to seize Sinai, which meant war with Yemen, and that war broke out in 1843. And in addition to Sinai, the Germans also took the port of Djibouti at the mouth of the Red Sea, and secured the creation of client states along the Persian Gulf coast, since they planned to strengthen their influence in Persia. And in Sinai, they immediately launched canal construction using Egyptian labor, completing it in 4 years. Incidentally, canals were also being built in the Netherlands, no surprise, particularly in Amsterdam, where the North Sea Canal was under construction to link Amsterdam with the North Sea, because by then ships had grown too large and deep-drafted to enter the Zuider Zee. So Rotterdam assumed the role of Germany's main port, although after the new canal was established, some ships began returning to the capital. And once the Suez Canal opened, freight traffic to Trieste and Venice surged. Then the Germans decided to expand their holdings in India and attacked the Nepalese Empire, testing how the new army performed against native forces, learning that it worked well, and ultimately seizing most of the Bay of Bengal coast from them. This war did not prevent them a year later from entering the conflict between Persia and Nepal, on the side of the latter. A rather flexible foreign policy, one that let them maintain a balance of power while carving off piece after piece from local states, without overly provoking either the locals or the Europeans, though Britain backed Persia. Yet the Germans still defeated their forces and secured a port on the Strait of Hormuz, thus taking control of the Persian Gulf. Next came protectorates over Tonkin and then Siam, so that by now almost all of Indochina lay under German rule. But German influence extended far beyond Asia. The tentacles of German octopus wrapped around the globe. And in many places, this influence was not imposed by force. Take the Americas. At the moment the German Empire was born, half of the South America lay in France's sphere of influence, as former French colonies, until the Germans transformed the Zollverein into the sphere of prosperity, by extending it to the entire world, working by a simple scheme. First they established friendly diplomatic relations, often through bribery, then secured investment rights, plowing funds mostly into agriculture and extractive industries, raw materials, which then they bought up themselves. And finally, offering to join their customs union to avoid tariffs, while hinting that refusal would lead to higher duties, rendering their raw materials worthless. In this way, they folded all of South America into their sphere of influence. cementing South America's status as a periphery. They even purchased the Isthmus of Panama from Colombia and built a canal there, to east trade with the Pacific West Coast. And the security of German investments rested on the premise that any nationalization of German assets would prompt the German army to sail in on the German navy and force their return to lawful owners, so that South American countries could be called semi-client states of Germany. Yet this peripheral status was barely felt in everyday life. For example, in 1870, the average coffee plantation worker earned 1.5 times more than the average factory worker in Amsterdam, and only automation changed that wage ratio, beginning in the 20th century. With the United States, the scheme worked partly. They agreed to tariff-free trade, but did not join the customs union itself, although mutual investment and trade still served as instruments of influence. And overall, the Germans were reluctant to pressure one of their true allies, besides Rus, because to the rest of the civilized world, that was Europe, Germany was like a stereotypical rich bully. Everyone hated them, but could do nothing. They were despised both ideologically and geopolitically. Ideologically, because after the Napoleonic Wars, Europe underwent the so-called absolutist revival, with all European countries except Germany, Rus and Carthage as absolute monarchies. Even in Britain, kings had dissolved parliament. And in the Netherlands, the rulers, upon donning the imperial crown, actually lost power, since through the Bundesrat they could veto any Reichstag law, though not always, as delegates could vote against the Kaiser's will, but von Auen could no longer pass their own laws. Thus the ruler's role ceased to be decisive. When Eitel Friedrich ascended the throne in 1852, it was narratively insignificant, for what can a king do for democracy if he truly supports it? And Eitel Friedrich was a supporter of democracy. Nothing. And that is exactly what he did. Nothing to impede democratic governance. Geopolitically, Germany was fast approaching hegemon status. Industrialization and production volumes were the measures of success. And in Germany, the Industrial Revolution proceeded many times faster than elsewhere. By 1860, Germany produced 2/3 of the world's steel, a tangible display of physical power and wealth, rather than the speculative intermediation of the Frisian Golden Age, though still fueled by colonial profits, meaning Germany could do anything that did not interfere with Rus or the United States, because things would not have been so good without allies. By the way, about the colonies. Germany at this time continued its expansion, which I think surprises no one. Their holdings in India were actively growing at the expense of the Nepali Empire, since there weren't really any other states left there. And Nepal was, well, a classic empire, a mess of peoples and religions, all just waiting for the central authority to show weakness, so they could rise up. That weakness came after Nepal's first defeats against the Germans, and the imposition of unequal treaties. That's when the Germans kicked things into gear, occupying eastern Bengal and the breakaway province of Sindh without a fight, in 1860. Sindh, by the way, was something they themselves had given Nepal earlier, after taking it from Persia. And then, 2 years later, the Germans backed various local separatists and openly went to war with Nepal. All the liberated territories, except Punjab, were pretty quickly integrated into the colonial administration, while Punjab itself even managed to conduct an independent foreign policy for quite a while. Then the British joined in on carving up Nepal, and by the end of the century, there was nothing left of the Nepali Empire. In 1868-69, there was a new Opium War, when the Chinese shut down German investment opportunities, and the war was won by the Germans without much trouble. In addition to restoring their investment rights, they also took China's possessions in Indochina, thus bringing the whole region under their control. At the same time, technological progress had finally reached a point where colonizing the African tropics became viable. Steamships made it possible to sail upriver against the current, ensuring reliable transport for the early stages of colonization, for expeditions, so to speak. And the new weapons like rifles, revolvers and machine guns allowed small contingents to defeat any locals unhappy with colonization. Railways allowed resources to be transported to the coast. The telegraph made it possible to manage colonies from the metropole almost instantly, and quinine made sure colonists didn't just drop dead from malaria while doing all previously mentioned. And so began the so-called Scramble for Africa, a colonial race to grab the biggest chunk of the continent as fast as possible. For most participants, Africa held a very practical appeal, as it was a source of resources like rubber, timber and minerals, along with various agricultural crops. But since the Germans had already taken over pretty much all the tropical lands with their colonies and spheres of influence, I mean, they basically had most of the colonies anyway. And since buying raw materials from the Germans was just beneath everyone's dignity, the Dark Continent turned out to be a kind of salvation for France and Britain. At first, colonization was chaotic. Everyone grabbed what they could. But after a number of clashes between colonizers, it was decided that to prevent the Scramble for Africa from turning into a war for Africa, the powers needed to sit down and discuss the division, their colonial claims, and their actual ability to hold those colonies. So in 1875, representatives of the colonial empires gathered in the capital of Carthage, Palermo. Basically, the whole conference could be described as a hypothetical war between the participants. The stronger a country's army and economy, the bigger a slice of Africa it could claim. This logic was dressed up as a scientific concept called social Darwinism, which was really just the idea that might makes right, in a lab coat. Social Darwinism was also applied to the conquered peoples, to justify colonial expansion, mostly to themselves, with the idea that Europeans could and should bring the light of civilization, using the labor of the locals as payment. That was the natural order of things. After a few months of discussion, they came to an agreement. And what you can see now, the map of Africa around 1888, is basically the implemented division. At that point, the only African state left was Egypt, and even that was under German protection. Speaking of Germany, of course they took part in the race and ended up grabbing a solid chunk, in line with their hegemonic status and the principles of social Darwinism. The German Governor-General in the Congo, Friedrich Wilhelm von Hindenburg, once said, "We, the German people, are destined to bring culture to those who are incapable of independent development. It is our duty to lead, even if it requires harsh measures." That said, South Africa had already been under German control before the Scramble, and while their other African colonies were large in size, they were pretty sparsely populated. The Congo was equatorial jungle, which wasn't exactly a comfy place to live at the time, and Somalia was a desert they took from Yemen mostly to better control the Suez Canal. Back then, population was actually one of the only decent indicators for judging the value of land, since there were many geological surveys. The idea was, if lots of people lived somewhere, then the land must be capable of supporting them. And so, by 1900, excluding Egypt and South Africa, were each around 25 million. The reasoning behind this balance was that the Germans already had more than enough colonies, which honestly made sense. And to be fair, African resources weren't even particularly needed by German industry at the time. The real issue was a labor shortage. Throughout the previous century, the main driver of economic growth and industrialization had been rural migration, peasants moving to cities and becoming factory workers. And as usual, everyone assumed the stream would never dry up, and that the countryside would forever supply the factories with labor. And while the flow did increase over time, especially after improvements in medicine, particularly the advent of vaccinations, it still wasn't enough, especially once school education actually became mandatory, and kids stopped being part of the workforce. But of course, economic growth was still highly desired, and by the 1880s, it was already slowing down. The obvious idea was to build factories in the colonies and the Americas, and that was happening. Gradually, investment started shifting from plantations to industrial development. But this created a problem. If you built factories in the colonies, it broke the whole system, where the core produced manufactured goods and the periphery supplied raw materials. So for a while, this process was actually slowed down deliberately, with investment bans imposed at the state level. They tried to solve the problem in several ways. They attracted migrants from the colonies. More accurately, they were brought in without being asked. They improved labor productivity, though that would have happened anyway. Paying a worker the same for more efficient labor was always a dream. And God forgive them, they even let women into the factories. The most successful, though, was good old-fashioned land grabbing in Europe. Germany's neighbors still had a lot of surplus rural population. And of course, this too was justified with social Darwinism. Apparently the rest of Europe couldn't even industrialize on its own, so someone had to take charge. Their gaze turned to Italy, with the official pretext for invasion being the abolition of debt slavery, which was still practiced there at the time. Around 14% of the population were contract slaves. And as everyone knows, the Germans were renowned humanitarians, at least when it was to their advantage. The real target, though, was Lombardy, whose name comes from the Germanic tribe of the Lombards, which basically means it should be part of Germany. Plus, the region just happened to have a bunch of people doing unproductive work. Britain and Byzantium sided with Italy, but Germany's navy was significantly stronger, so they couldn't do much to help. And Italy eventually capitulated and fulfilled German demands. Then Germany turned its sights on France, waging two wars against it, both triggered by French attempts to grab colonies in Asia. First in 1896, trying to establish a protectorate over Korea and ended up losing Normandy, where the population was German-speaking, and then 4 years later trying the same trick with Japan, only to lose Savoy and Piedmont, while Japan itself became a German protectorate. For them it was at least a familiar evil. Some people never learn. Still, all these conquests and annexations didn't change the big picture. The natural trend toward industrial growth outside Europe couldn't be reversed, and over time Germany began to lose its massive share of global production. The best metric for this is steel output. In 1875, they still produced around 2/3 of the world's steel. But by 1910, that had dropped to 50%. The decline wasn't huge, because in other countries, German investors were happy to develop industries with low automation and low worker skill requirements, like textiles, while keeping the technically complex stuff, like the budding electrical and automotive sectors, at home. For comparison, Germany's share in textile production during the same period plummeted from the infamous 2/3 to just 15%. But as German industrial dominance waned, German capital took its place. German companies started building and buying up everything they could within the prosperity sphere and beyond. For those who willingly accepted, or were forced to accept German investment, it felt like a deal with the devil. At first, you'd get a burst of economic growth. Japan, for example, tripled its economy within 10 years of becoming protectorate. But once German companies established monopolies, they'd start lobbying for low corporate taxes. And the profits, of course, flowed into German pockets, bankrupting local entrepreneurs and preventing them from developing high-tech industries. And any complaints could be addressed directly to the German army and navy. Still, countries that accepted the investments generally saw a significantly better standard of living than those that didn't. Wages weren't deliberately suppressed, and German companies had a vested interest in building decent state institutions to ensure the rules were followed. Naturally, rules rigged in their favor. For Germany, investments became the new way to maintain hegemony. By 1910, German companies controlled nearly 75% of global GDP. Smells like world domination. Other countries thought so too, especially Rusinia. And over the course of 40 years, its relationship with Germany did a full 180. The main issue, once again, was those investments. Investment treaties between the Netherlands and Rusinia dated back to the 18th century, and companies in both countries owned property in the other. This was unpopular from the start with many in both nations, especially the petite and middle bourgeoisie, the most nationalistic demographic. And nationalists generally hate globalization, seeing it as a tool for foreign exploitation. Anyway, their opinions were ignored for a long time. But the Netherlands turned into Germany and kept growing in power, along with the volume of their investments. By the late 19th century, Germans owned 40% of the Ruthenian economy. And since this was the golden age of imperialism, when European empires ruled most of the world, Ruthenia, being one of those empires and a great power in its own right, couldn't accept such foreign influence and tore up its alliance and investment treaty with Germany, accusing it of meddling in its internal affairs. It was mostly a one-sided breakup. If you compare it to another German ally, the USA, not exactly a weakling either. German capital made up half of that economy, but no one saw that as a problem. The big difference? The Atlantic Ocean, which could be used if there was a need to seize German assets, and the different visions their governments had of their role in the world. The US just wanted to live well, Ruthenia wanted to be an empire and influence the world. Still, the Ruthenians didn't dare nationalize German assets, afraid of fighting Germany one-on-one. After all, there was a flat plain, not an ocean, between them. Meanwhile, in Amsterdam, the decision was made. If Ruthenia didn't want to be an ally, then Germany had to secure its borders by creating buffer states. However, there was also fear that if war broke out, other neighbors would seize the moment to attack, and around the time Germany had its first taste of positional warfare. Trenches, barbed wire, dugouts, machine guns, all the fancy new ways of turning war into a muddy meat grinder. Against just France, they could win by sheer numbers and a few breakthroughs, not giving the enemy time to dig in. But in a multi-front war with evenly matched forces, that wouldn't work. And so, a tense peace descended over Central Europe, lasting a decade. Germany actively tried to provoke its neighbors into war, France in particular, with military drills during which they accidentally crossed the border in 1906 and 1909. But the French ruler at the time, General Justin Gerard, stubbornly refused to take the bait. And once it became clear that France wasn't going to jump into war, the Germans shifted their focus to provoking Ruthenia. In 1910, they invaded Persia, which had remained mostly independent because Ruthenia and Germany couldn't agree on how to divide it. But once large and easily accessible oil reserves were discovered in the Persian Gulf, letting them go became unthinkable. After the war, Germany expanded its territory by annexing Kazakhstan, where most of the oil was, and secured extraction rights across Persia. As you can probably guess, Ruthenia didn't intervene. But soon, the Germans gave them a reason big enough that simply couldn't be ignored. At this time, a civil war broke out in Italy, and Germans got involved, not by picking a side, but by declaring that Italy was essentially a failed state, and that they were taking the Italians under their protection. After all, Italians living in Germany enjoyed a higher level of self-governance and quality of life than those living in Italy itself. Which, to be fair, was true, since Italy remained an absolute monarchy. This was the last straw for the neighbors, who began joining an anti-German coalition. Ruthenia, Great Britain, Byzantium, Greater Moravia, along with their puppets and colonies. As expected, France had no intention of entering the war, quite reasonably assuming that if they did, they'd bear the brunt of the fighting, and they didn't really have any allies to rely on. And indeed, it was precisely for this reason that the Germans initially tried to provoke France. In Europe, Germany was supported by Carthage, which had recently become its new ally, and incidentally, another happy recipient of German investment. But Germany's main allies were overseas, the United States and Colombia, who backed Germany because it was their key trading partner and security guarantor. Both sides had roughly the same goals: to carve off territories with non-titular majorities from their rivals and to seize their colonies. In Germany, it was believed that victory in this war would cement their place as the undisputed leaders in global politics, which is why they called it the War to End All Wars. In historiography, the more popular name became the First World War, implying that more wars would follow. And so, the war began on December 26, 1911, with a German invasion of Italy, according to a plan devised by Chief of the General Staff Helmut von Moltke and General Bernd Kohler. The core idea was to quickly knock out the most vulnerable opponents, Great Britain and Greater Moravia, whose capitals and largest cities were relatively close to the border. Britain, without naval supremacy, was an easy target, and their navy was indeed significantly weaker than Germany's. And Moravia's capital region was already in a semi-encircled position. As I've mentioned before, the Germans had experience with trench warfare, which turns into a meat grinder when both sides are evenly matched. Their solution to this problem was armored vehicles, tanks and armored cars, designed to break through defensive lines. Overall, the plan was solid. Germany had a technological edge, and if you counted the American allies, even a numerical advantage. But as usual, war planners tend to overestimate themselves and underestimate the enemy, which is exactly what happened. The main snack came in Britain, where the Germans struggled to gain a foothold and seize ports to secure reliable supply lines. Thus, the war that was supposed to last 6 months turned into a year-long conflict. Still, not bad. Italy was the first to capitulate, and the puppet regime was installed there. Then a separate peace was signed with Greater Moravia. After a successful campaign in the Middle East, Byzantium surrendered at the mercy of the victors. And on January 4th, 1913, both Rus and Great Britain signed acts of capitulation. As a result of these peace deals, Germany implemented the plan to create buffer states. Territories with non-titular majorities were separated from the defeated powers, and new national states were created in their place. Not all of them, of course, only those that could be defended without issue and were economically beneficial. Scotland and Wales remained in the UK, and the newly established Tatarstan, for instance, didn't include most of the Turkic population, and Siberia, with all its many peoples, wasn't even touched. The biggest loser was Great Moravia, which was completely dissolved as a feudal empire and relic of the past, reverting back to Bohemia. These newly created states had independence, but not sovereignty, and were quickly incorporated into the sphere of prosperity and the League of Nations, a new organization created to give the illusion that this wasn't Germany doing whatever it wanted, but rather the international community working together to decide what should be done. After all, the League of Nations covered most of the world's landmass and population. And naturally, nearly everyone just voted however Germany told them to. For example, the colonies taken from the defeated countries were handed over to Germany as mandate territories, with Carthage getting a slice too, supposedly because they would manage them more fairly and efficiently. Another major decision by the League of Nations was recognizing German as its official language, and by extension, the primary international language. This made it recommended, meaning mandatory, for study in schools. In practice, this didn't change much, and was only really necessary in the liberated territories in Europe, since German was already required learning in German colonies. In the Americas, thanks to both demographic influence, roughly 12 million Germans had immigrated there during the 19th century, and cultural technological dominance, countries like Argentina, a former French colony with a German-speaking majority, found it easier to switch to German as their official language. Germany and its former colonies, the USA, were the engines of scientific and cultural progress, so most academic works were written in German, and most of the world's intelligentsia spoke it. So it's no surprise that German still holds the uncontested top spot as the international language. Which means you should thank me. I'm telling you this story in English, a local, utterly unnecessary language. No offense. In truth, the only real point of the League of Nations recognizing German was to prepare for the economic integration of the new European states into the German market, by introducing German into their educational systems. Now, let's talk about what was happening in German domestic politics. Germany, as we know, was a federation, and each member had votes in the upper house of parliament, the Bundesrat. There, the Netherlands couldn't push anything through solo. However, with the acquisition of new territories, directly subordinated to the emperor, this balance was disrupted by the 20th century. And as I mentioned earlier, emperors no longer played an active role in domestic politics, creating a strange balance of power where the Bundesrat, whose members were appointed by emperors, held significant authority. At the same time, the Reichstag played a major role. In theory, due to inflation, practically everyone owned the minimum required property worth 10,000 guldens. Thus all adult males were voters. But in practice, it was still the wealthy and very well off who got the most votes, although outright capitalists only held about 17% of the votes. Real power rested with the upper middle class, senior managers, engineers, bureaucrats. Of course, to the common folk, whether the country was run by the rich or the super rich didn't matter. They still didn't care about the working man, so strikes began. Then women joined the movement, who incidentally didn't have any voting rights at all. The government made concessions to the workers, But there was a growing sense that the distribution of power needed to be restructured, without threats or disruption, in a civilized manner, you understand. The foundation was already there, high levels of municipal self-governance and the existence of trade unions, which were the ones organizing the strikes. The idea was to integrate these organizations into the governing process, so they would have a voice, but not real power, and so trade unions and capitalists could negotiate without resorting to extreme measures. This ideology came to be known as German corporatism, and it ended up being a solid foundation for the state's further transformation. The only obstacle was the Bundesrat, a legacy of Germany's confederative beginnings. With its fairly autonomous German principalities, who weren't too eager to see that legacy dismantled, because that would mean losing their leverage over state policy. And since there were no legal mechanisms to deal with the Bundesrat, the issue had to be handled by other means, if you catch my drift. The main initiator of change was the then leader of the ruling National People's Party and chairman of the Reichstag, the young corporatist Reinhard Schuster. In October 1913, having secured the support of the military and the Industrialist Party, he organized a de facto coup d'etat. First, the Reichstag successfully passed a vote on a draft of the new constitution, which sharply curtailed the monarch's powers. He was now limited to foreign policy only, reformatted the Bundesrat into an elected regional representative body, abolished confederative elements, which basically meant stripping power from the princes, and created a new organ for socio-economic coordination, the Council of Corporations, largely inspired by medieval estate representative bodies, such as the Landtag in the Netherlands. Emperor Ludwig Victor, yes, they had stopped calling themselves Dirks, Florises or Philips for some reason, responded positively to the reform, so there was no trouble from his camp, and the Bundesrat couldn't do anything without the emperor anyway. And then things got even spicier. Corporatism drew inspiration from the Middle Ages. And what else was there in the Middle Ages? Our old acquaintance, the Holy Roman Empire. And what was the core idea of that empire, at least at its founding? Unifying the Christians of the Western Roman Empire. It wasn't called that horrendous name for nothing. In essence, uniting Europeans. Well, Germany already had Italians, Poles, and others within its borders who lived quite good, actually. So why shouldn't the Germans, being the largest and most powerful nation in Europe, unify it? The Reichstag decided this was an excellent idea and declared the creation of a federal state, the Pan-European Union, more commonly known as the United States of Europe, the USE. Simultaneously sending troops into Bohemia and Italy and holding highly questionable referendums on joining the Union, which naturally passed with over 80% support. The newly formed state had a population of about 170 million in the metropole, of which Germans made up around 60%. So yeah, there was the potential to ditch federalism and build an empire. But they didn't go that route. They really were trying to make a state for all Europeans, planning to gradually integrate the newly formed eastern states as their economies improved with German investment. German remained compulsory as the federal language, but the federal system allowed other nations to freely teach their own languages, and even open schools for one nationality in regions dominated by another. For instance, Croatian schools in Prague or Italian ones in Alsace. The German National People's Party, which had pushed all these reforms, even rebranched itself to represent all nations, becoming the European Pan-Nationalist Socialist Party, though everyone just called them the Nazi Party. And they really did engage in socialist activities, as far as a party representing the middle class could. They introduced a unified percentage-based tax rate, replacing the flat tax system where both workers and capitalists paid the same absolute amount. Bureaucratically convenient, but utterly unfair. Sure, capitalists were taxed through luxury goods excises, but that still brought in less than taxes on the poor. Anyway, they also, in cooperation with trade unions, improved working conditions and raised average wages. Thanks to this, the Nazis' reputation, and Schuster's in particular, skyrocketed, though much of the success stemmed from the overall strength of the German economy. Several factors aligned. New colonies made raw materials cheaper, new European states provided plenty of affordable labor, new markets opened up, new construction materials spread, Assembly line production boomed, electrification, motorization, oil extraction, all that stuff. All this led to the USE and the prosperity sphere experiencing rapid economic growth during the first third of the 20th century, accompanied by major changes in society, culture, art, architecture, and so on. Cinema deserves special mention. It had finally gained sound and evolved from a one-off curiosity into mainstream entertainment. The Germans were the first to enter international film distribution, quickly grabbing a significant market share, although no one had total dominance. Economic growth was paired with rising living standards, though the highest general standard of living wasn't in the USA, but in Colombia, which, thanks to small population and massive oil production, had become a petrostate, and in the USA, then a global oil leader. And in terms of GDP per capita, Azerbaijan led the pack, though that was mainly due to the newly incorporated territories. Most of the extraction sites, by the way, were owned by Germans, and given the high prices, one could say the economy was truly booming, since expensive raw materials typically signal rising demand, and extraction couldn't keep up with consumption. And to solve that shortage, they just grabbed new oil fields in the Middle East, taking Iraq from Persia without a war, thereby linking up their colonies in the region. Now, for further context, it's worth talking a bit about what was happening to the other countries of Europe. First and foremost, the losers of the Great War: Britain, Ruthenia, and Byzantium. The defeat dealt a heavy blow to the stability of the monarchic regimes in place. After all, the populations blamed their governments for dragging them into the war, and this led to revolutions, which in turn resulted in the overthrow of monarchies and the establishment of democratic republics. Then came the gradual build-up of resentment towards the Germans. It was they who had taken everything they possibly could from the defeated empires, and this resentment expressed itself differently, depending on the country. In Byzantium, reactionaries staged a military coup, which escalated into a civil war, ultimately ending with the rise of a totalitarian regime under the personal dictatorship of despot Costa Makrakis, who had been inspired by German corporatism with its cooperation between social units, though he twisted it beyond recognition. In Ruthenia, a similar regime took hold in the 1920s, though via a constitutional coup, meaning the parliament rewrote the constitution without a referendum, under the leadership of the ruling party's leader, Lev Kornienko. What united these two states was the fact that the Germans, under the terms of the peace treaties, had taken what you could call their ancestral lands, territories populated not necessarily by a majority, but by a significant portion of their titular nations, Greeks and Ruthenians, respectively. And the return of those lands became one of the central ideas of their states. Now we move on to Great Britain, which also underwent a constitutional coup, though this time it wasn't nationalists who came to power, since the English didn't harbor particular resentment toward the Germans as a people, but rather communist totalists, since there was resentment toward German capital. Democracy was dismantled, the country was run by the Vanguard Council, and the economy was centrally planned. France also deserves a mention. The people there were growing increasingly discontent with the government's decision to remain out of the war, though I'd argue their participation wouldn't have changed much anyway. And as a result, France kept its colonies intact. After the death of Justin Gerard, unrest began, and the Democratic Coalition came to power, led by syndicalist communists, whose main distinction from their island comrades was that they preserved a market economy, with ownership being handed to workers through a system of shares. Also, a multi-party system remained in place. Somehow, this system actually functioned quite well, and the standard of living in France reached parity with that of Germany. By the way, why didn't the Germans do anything about it? Well, for two reasons. First, they didn't need to, since they believed they had already won. Second, expanding the USA by war wasn't all that appealing, because coercion rarely leads to anything good. And besides, they needed to first integrate the eastern regions, which required the general education system to kick in, and that takes at least a generation. Plus, the USA began having problems elsewhere, specifically in its colonies, where a series of uprisings took place in the 1920s. First in South America, where in 1922 there was a rebellion against the colonial administration, then in Egypt, where that same year a revolt erupted against the puppet government, and then in Guangzhou, where in 1924 there was a nationalist uprising by the Cantonese. What united all these revolts was that they were all suppressed, and also that the globalized economy created by the Germans functioned, because all the rebels had enterprises linked by supply chains to other countries, and with those chains broken, their economies collapsed within a few months. Next came a major war against Korea and China. The main reason was that by that time Korea was still independent, and the other great powers wanted to carve it up for themselves, so the Germans had to act preemptively. The official pretext was the persistence of debt slavery in Korea. China, fattened on German investments, came to Korea's aid, but it didn't help them much, and they kept losing just like in the previous century, even though the Germans had to march through half of Korea and China to convince them of that. As a result of the war, Korea became a USA protectorate, and Germany took Shandong from China, which had previously taken it from the Celestial Taiping State, Germany's Protestant proxy, and Western Guangdong, to create a land connection from Guangzhou to China. With the annexation of Guangdong, local separatists from the Min people gained access to a new recruitment base and launched a fresh uprising, this time even in Formosa. Though again, it didn't help them, though they did manage to hold out for over a year. Let's move away from rebellions and return to the economy, where by late 1920s, a slowdown in growth began to appear. Put simply, they had hit the technological ceiling again, and the new workforce, educated in the German system in the eastern states, hadn't yet come of age. And without growth, capitalism doesn't work. You have to show investors pretty graphs pointing upward, or whatever they showed back then. So companies started investing in so-called mega projects, massive in scale and questionable in output. Let's break down the biggest ones in descending order of sense. Zuiderzee-werk, a system of dams and land drainage works that separated the Zuiderzee from the North Sea and turned the inland waters into polders. Flood protection and farmland at the coast of a 30-kilometer dam. Not bad at all. Rheinstadt, an enormous agglomeration, a megalopolis that was supposed to unite the major cities around the northern Rhine, which had grown during industrialization, into a single urban system with shared infrastructure and a massive park. Overall, this project wasn't even bad, it just needed to be postponed by around 30 years, which is exactly what happened. Then came the Trans-African Railway and highway networks, connecting Alexandria to Cape Town. These roads were largely useless, since cheap and efficient sea freight already existed, and construction and maintenance in hot, humid Africa was very expensive. And the dumbest project of all was the greening of the Sahara, the artificial Nile. It envisioned building a massive dam on the Congo River, which would have flooded tens of thousands of square kilometers of equatorial forest. A challenge in itself, given that it was the rainforest. And then digging canals all the way to the Sahara. The locals hated the project, and in 1931 they rose up in revolt, which had to be brutally suppressed. The dam's construction continued, but at a slower pace. Also gaining popularity were margin investments, buying company stock on credit secured by that same stock, with loans having extremely low interest rates, around 1%. The idea was terrible, since it wildly inflated company valuations without increasing their productivity. Both of these types of questionable investment usually result in an economic bubble, and soon came the event that put an end to all that speculation. On November 25, 1935, the bubble burst with the crash of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, a moment that would go down in history as Black Monday. That said, the exact cause and trigger of the crisis are still unclear. Economics, after all, competes with astrology in terms of precision. After Amsterdam, other exchanges across the prosperity sphere collapsed as well, and the market completely tanked. But the Netherlands had already dealt with similar crises before, just flooded everything with money, and the USA government had plenty of funds. Plus, unemployment was virtually non-existent, as the USA actually faced a labor shortage, so the crisis lasted only 3 years. It became the spark for pent-up frustration in the colonies. And just 2 weeks later, a wave of uprisings broke out across India, China, and Indochina. The entire colonial order, built by the Frisians and held together by force, began to unravel once too many revolts flared up at once. Basically, wherever there weren't enough European troops in the colonial forces, uprisings were successful. This is how Thailand, Vietnam, most of India, Guangdong, and Japan broke away. Japan even sent troops in Korea and annexed it. Relations also soured with the major oil exporters, Colombia and the USA, since economic crises bring a sharp drop in raw material demand. In general, the Americas were hit by the crisis perhaps even harder than the USA, so it's no surprise that the whole continent slipped into isolationism and left the prosperity sphere, which also meant it took them longer to recover. So in the upcoming war, neither side had support from those guys. And war was already on the horizon, as the crisis in the USA signaled weakness and the chance for revenge to the defeated powers, possibly their only one. Over the next 2 years, they ramped up militarization and began forming an anti-German coalition made up of 2 alliances, the Communist International and the Axis. The Communists were fairly straightforward. France and Britain, despite ideological differences, both aimed for global revolution, and the USA, as the main capitalist power, was their biggest threat. The Third International was actually founded even before the crisis. For them, war was essentially an act of desperation, because starting in late 1937, the USA began rapidly building up its military capacity, preparing to wipe out the communist threat in the West, and, while they were at it, integrate France and Britain into European unity. The Axis, Kiev, Constantinople, Tehran, was formed in 1938 as part of a secret plan for revenge, developed together with the International. According to the plan, all of them were supposed to attack the USA that same year, and since the Americas were no longer backing the Germans, and France was now on the coalition side, they figured they actually had a decent shot. At least that's what they thought. But, as tends to happen with alliances between natural enemies, something went wrong. Ruthenia and Byzantium did indeed attack the USA and its sphere of influence on August 28. At the outbreak of war, the Eastern Front saw a rough balance of forces, with Ruthenia holding a slight advantage in the Caspian region, allowing them to seize Crimea, and the USA enjoying a slight edge in the Middle East, which let them capture a corridor between their colonies and Armenia. Meanwhile, the Communists were supposed to strike from the west. It was meant to be a combined blow. But the French, realizing that in a two-front war the Germans would focus their main forces on them, decided to wait it out again, planning to attack only after Germany shifted troops eastward. And in first assumption, they weren't wrong. The USA was still working off the Moltke plan in the event of a two-front war, and had indeed concentrated its forces in the west. But in their second assumption, they were very wrong. Instead of shifting troops to the east, the Germans themselves launched an attack on France on September 3rd, using strategy of swift, maneuverable warfare. Blitzkrieg. Armored wedges, with heavy air support, broke through the front lines deeply, destroying command and logistics networks and encircling major cities and border forces. And since the Germans held an overwhelming advantage in both equipment and air power, not to mention the coalition barely had any armor at all, the strategy worked beautifully. After just a month of fighting, they had encircled and captured Paris, and wiped out a third of the French army. At this point, the anti-German coalition realized things weren't looking good. Still, the French weren't quick to surrender, so the Germans had to encircle another third of their army and occupy most of the country by the end of 1938, which was pretty fast. Next, the USA turned its attention to Britain, launching yet another landing on the island, taking advantage of a breach in the British cipher and control over the channel, which allowed the first wave of troops to land almost without a fight. Once they had secured a solid beachhead, they transferred nearly the entire French contingent there. The British, having already lost part of their army in France, couldn't organize any proper defense. Within a week, London had fallen, and just a month later, the act of Britain's capitulation was already signed. According to the peace treaty, transitional governments were established in France and Britain to reintegrate them into the market economy. as well as to create local self-governance in the provinces. The goal being to turn them into federations and later break them down into the very provinces that, 20 years later, were integrated into the USE. After all, large entities like France and England would clearly pull too much power to themselves. But Picardy or the Midlands, for instance, looked perfectly at home within the USE framework. As for Canada, they just set up a provisional government there, for democratization and decommunization. The next target for the German tanks was Byzantium, which at that point was losing even to colonial troops in Anatolia, so they collapsed rather quickly, within 2 months. After occupying the European part of Byzantium and encircling most of their army, they agreed to sign the Act of Surrender. Then it was Ruthenia's turn, and because of its sheer size, it turned out to be the most difficult opponent. In the last Great War, the Ruthenians, realizing the imbalance of power, surrendered rather quickly, and the Germans never had to march deep into Ruthenia. But this time, for their government, it was an existential war, because the USE planned to subjugate all of Europe. That meant they'd have to go all the way to the Urals to force them to surrender. The initial USE plan for the war against Ruthenia involved 2 flanking strikes, from the Baltics and from Tatarstan, intending to encircle the Ruthenian heartland and its capital. It was an ambitious plan, as they would have to capture a strip about 1,200 kilometers long, and fairly wide too, to secure the roads and railways needed to supply the advancing invasion forces. However, the Ruthenians got wind of this plan and sabotaged the roads along the route, something that became apparent during a test advance while operations in Byzantium were still ongoing. So the plan had to be scrapped, and the war was fought the old-fashioned way, attacking along the whole front, turning it into a war of attrition. The advantage still clearly belonged to the USE. Its metropolitan population alone outnumbered Ruthenia's by almost 100 million. But in this kind of war, manpower losses quickly reached into the millions. Still, the advance went quite well, and by August they had pushed far enough to reach supply lines the Ruthenians simply couldn't destroy anymore. Doing so would have cut off their own connection to the rest of the country, which would be the same as encirclement. Speaking of encirclement, now it could actually be carried out, though on a smaller scale than originally planned, and together with Kiev, half of the Ruthenian army was left surrounded. After the encirclement was sealed in October, they were physically unable to cover such an enormous front, and the war, for the most part, turned into a slow march, which, due to the vast distances, dragged on until March of the following year. At the peace conference in Constantinople, the same approach was taken with Ruthenia and Byzantium as with France and Britain. Temporary governments were installed with the goal of future integration into the USE. After all, they were Christians too, and therefore Europeans. The Ruthenians were even reformed, just like the Frisians. As for Persia, which had surrendered even earlier than Ruthenia, it was simply placed under a protectorate. After the end of this war, the USE emerged as the absolute global hegemon, and the only remaining potential threat was China, where radical nationalists had come to power under a certain Shan. Yes, that Shan, who had extracted the greatest benefits from the USE crisis and the subsequent wars. He nationalized German companies and plantations on Chinese territory, no small thing, as they made up half of the local economy. Built a large military industry on that foundation, conquered weaker neighbors, and after the war in Europe began, moved to occupy German proxies in the region. But reclaiming their national territories wasn't enough for them. They pushed further and attacked Japan for its colonies in Siberia, even managing successful landings on the islands, and then stabbed Ruthenia in the back, carving off a piece of its eastern lands. They hadn't shown open aggression toward the USE, of course, but that was understandable. They were still significantly weaker, and, true to ancient Chinese wisdom, they struck only when confident of easy victory. The key word being still. China, at that point, was already home to 500 million people, who, under ongoing industrialization and militarization, could pose a serious threat, especially under Shan's rule. So, the USE government was faced with a choice: let things slide and risk facing a future war, or deal with Shan now, while they still had a mobilized army ready, and the Chinese were busy finishing off the Japanese. 50 years earlier, this wouldn't even have been a debate. Of course, you strike those ungrateful yellow monkeys, get your investments back, and while you're at it, reclaim all your lost colonies across Asia. But now, they actually had to weigh whether sacrificing soldiers' lives was worth a not strictly necessary war for total global dominance. War was no longer the default tool of politics. For example, with the Indian and Indochinese states that had broken away from the German colonial empire, they reached agreements without fighting, and even got some of their investments back. Though, frankly, they could have pulled off some indirect genocide, if they really wanted to. Still, the general public supported the idea of intervening in China, despite the 2 million casualties in the recent European war. Because Germans, and honestly most other peoples within the USE at that point, had what you might call a savior complex. We know better how to improve life for others, how to build an economy and social institutions. So everything we do is really just helping people. It's our mission, the white man's burden. And they hadn't really shaken it off yet, not even after the crisis. In the end, they decided to spare their descendants a future problem, and began preparing for an invasion of China, taking advantage of the fact that China was still at war with Japan. First, they demanded that China release Shandong, the Heavenly Kingdom, God help us, Japan, Korea, Bhutan, and Uyghuristan, return all seized investments, grant full investment rights, pay hefty reparations, and hand over Shan to a tribunal, and open a joint investigation into his and his clique's activities. In short, a soft version of capitulation. Naturally, Shan and his cronies refused. For what he'd done, he was facing the death penalty. And let's be honest, that's hardly a spoiler for anyone. Moreover, the Chinese had been beating the Japanese pretty soundly, whose army had been trained using German instructors, and they assumed the USE would not be much stronger. Well, they were wrong. On May 26, USE forces reached the borders of China and Ruthenia, as well as the remaining colonial enclaves in China, and launched a rapid offense on all fronts, sweeping aside the weak defenses the Chinese had managed to cobble together. It turned out the Chinese were completely unprepared for the sheer volume of tanks and aircraft that European industry had churned out by then, and within the months, China's industrial heartland, the eastern part of the interior, was under occupation. The European advance slowed somewhat after that, since they had to cross countless rivers and canals, supply lines were worse, and in general the western terrain was more mountainous and forested, and the Chinese soldiers defended fiercely. Still, it was blitzkrieg in nature, and once it became clear that resistance was futile, the Chinese military officers, not affiliated with the radical nationalists, staged a coup, capitulated, and handed over Shan and his clique in October. The victory came at relatively low cost, at least compared to the wars in Europe, with several 100,000 killed and around 500,000 wounded. Under the peace treaty, China gave up all territories and assets seized after 1935, and the same approach used for European countries was applied to China, division into a multitude of provinces. The difference was that integrating Chinese provinces into the USE was clearly not on the table, and the transitional governments set up to democratize China couldn't maintain political control forever. After all, it was transitional. But handing power in such a massive country back to a single government would have been dangerous. What if they wanted revenge? So, they needed a way to weaken China's future potential. The solution was the creation of the Chinese Confederation, something between the German Empire and the Holy Roman Empire in terms of internal autonomy. Each province effectively became an independent state, with its own army and the right to conduct its own foreign policy, leading to internal competition. In short, the principle of divide and rule was applied to China. And well, we can judge its effectiveness from where we stand today. Thus, the USE achieved global dominance in a single stroke, and the remaining states, especially those in the Americas, were forced to rejoin the global economy in order to overcome the protracted crisis. At the time, contemporaries called it the end of history, and assumed the future would be dull. But as we know, well, we know. That was the end of the Second World War, and with it, the end of this story. And so, this was the 1000-year history of the Netherlands. Or more precisely, what they could have been and become. Thanks to the patrons who chose this topic, between it, Vinland and the Persian Empire. Someone from this list definitely voted for it, but almost everyone dropped out over the course of the year. I don't hold it against you. After all, I didn't post anything. By the way, you too can become a patron and choose topics for future videos. As for those who cannot or do not want to give me money, you can like this video and subscribe to the channel, so you don't miss any new videos. There is also a map of religions as of 1936, if anyone is interested. Well, that's all for now. Bid you farewell.